The building wakes before the sun does. Long fluorescent lights hum softly above narrow government hallways where the air still carries the coolness of the night. Somewhere beyond the frosted windows, trucks shift gears along distant streets while the city remains mostly asleep beneath the last dark stretch before dawn. Inside the recruiting office, chairs sit in neat rows against pale walls marked by years of cigarette smoke and damp winter coats brushing against the paint. Papers wait in careful stacks across metal desks. Ink bottles. Rubber stamps. Typed forms aligned with mechanical precision. Nothing here appears dramatic enough to belong to history. A janitor moves quietly through the corridor with slow, deliberate motions, his mop gliding across worn floor tiles that reflect the weak overhead light in long faded strips. Somewhere deeper in the building, a typewriter begins its steady rhythm long before the front doors officially open. Keys strike paper with clipped metallic certainty. Stop. Return. Strike again. The sound carries faintly through the empty hallway like machinery preparing itself for another day of sorting men into categories the institution already understands. You stand near the far end of the corridor where a bulletin board hangs beside the entrance to the recruiting office. Notices overlap one another in uneven layers. Enlistment quotas, ration announcements, transport schedules, casualty reports folded carefully beneath official seals. The war presses itself into the building through paperwork first. Columns of names. Numbers revised weekly. Requests for more men. More mechanics. More bodies capable of fitting themselves into systems already strained by expansion. Outside, dawn still hesitates. The windows hold only vague reflections for now. Desks, lamps, empty chairs repeated faintly against the glass while the city beyond remains hidden in darkness. A radiator knocks softly somewhere along the wall, struggling to push warmth into the cold administrative air. The building feels suspended between old habits and approaching change, though no one inside it would describe the sensation that way aloud. Then the front door opens. Cold air moves briefly through the hallway carrying traces of wet pavement, engine smoke, and the distant scent of coal burning somewhere beyond the station district. Alfred Masters steps inside holding his hat carefully beneath one arm. His coat still carries the chill of the morning outside. Water glistens faintly along the shoulders before disappearing beneath the hallway light. For a moment, very little happens. A clerk glances up from behind the reception desk, then down again toward the forms already spread before him. Another man farther back in the office pauses while removing a cigarette from a metal tin. The silence lasts only seconds. Yet the pause itself feels visible, as though the room is recalculating something quietly within its own routines. The Marine Corps has existed for generations with certain assumptions embedded so deeply inside it that most men no longer notice them. Traditions settle into institutions the way dust settles into floorboards, gradually, invisibly, until no one remembers when the surface first changed color. For decades, Black Marines have existed largely as absence inside the Corps. Not argument. Not debate. Simply omission reinforced through repetition until it began to resemble permanence. Now the war is changing the shape of permanence. Not quickly, not willingly, but steadily enough that offices like this one have begun encountering situations their procedures were never designed to accommodate comfortably. Alfred understands this before anyone explains it to him. You can see it in the stillness with which he removes his gloves, in the patience of his posture while waiting for the clerk to finally speak. The man behind the desk clears his throat softly. Name. Alfred Masters. The pen pauses briefly above the paper before continuing again. Nearby, another typewriter resumes its rhythm through the office. Keys striking harder now. Drawers opening. Forms sliding across desks beneath tired hands already preparing for another endless day of wartime processing. Yet beneath the ordinary movement of administration, something quieter presses against the structure of the room itself. History rarely announces its return when it first steps through the door. Usually, it waits silently while institutions decide whether they are prepared to recognize it. Before you continue deeper into the silence, routines, and long corridors ahead, take a moment to subscribe, but only if stories shaped by quiet endurance, institutional memory, and the slow movement of history feel like your kind of listening. And let us know where you're listening from, or which image stays with you the longest tonight. The office smells faintly of paper dust, tobacco, and radiator heat that never fully reaches the corners of the room. Morning gathers slowly beyond the windows now, not through sunlight but through visibility. Shapes begin emerging outside the glass. Telephone poles, narrow sidewalks slick from the night cold, delivery trucks idling beside the curb with steam curling from their exhaust into the pale blue hour before sunrise fully arrives. Inside the recruiting station, the machinery of enlistment settles into rhythm. Forms are stamped. Folders tied with string. Names entered into ledgers already thick with fingerprints and worn edges from constant handling. Alfred sits in a wooden chair positioned slightly apart from the others waiting along the wall. Most of the men inside the office avoid looking at one another directly this early in the morning. Some stare toward the floor while turning caps slowly between their hands. Others study recruitment posters mounted beside the windows. Clean uniforms, polished boots, broad promises printed beneath painted flags. A few speak quietly about transport schedules or relatives already overseas. Their voices remain low, shaped by fatigue and uncertainty rather than excitement. You watch Alfred remain almost completely still while the room moves around him. He is not the only man waiting to enter the corps that morning. But he is the only one whose presence subtly alters the atmosphere of the office itself. Clerks return to his paperwork more than once. An officer near the rear desk removes his glasses twice while rereading a line already understood perfectly well. No one openly challenges him. That would require clarity. The discomfort here feels procedural rather than theatrical, woven into pauses too small to formally acknowledge. The war has begun forcing old institutions into unfamiliar negotiations with themselves. Across the room, a Marine sergeant carrying a stack of files stops briefly beside the desk nearest the window. His uniform hangs sharply despite the early hour, collar stiff, boots polished to a dark shine beneath the fluorescent lights. He glances toward Alfred for only a moment before lowering his voice toward the clerk beside him. The words remain too quiet to fully hear from where you stand, but the effect travels visibly through the room anyway. Another pause. Another recalculation. Another brief silence settling over ordinary administrative movement. Then the work resumes. Because the war leaves very little time for institutions to linger inside uncertainty forever. The Marine Corps needs men now in ways it has not needed them before. Supply routes expand across oceans. Barracks fill faster than they can be built. Ships depart carrying replacements for casualties that arrive faster each month in folded telegrams and typed reports. Somewhere far beyond this office, entire systems already strain beneath the scale of mobilization. The pressure reaches this room indirectly through quotas, revised directives, and orders arriving from higher offices that carry the force of necessity even when tradition resists following them comfortably. A clock mounted along the wall clicks softly through the silence. 1 minute. Then another. Finally, the sergeant crosses the room toward Alfred with a file tucked beneath one arm. The floorboards creak beneath measured footsteps polished by years of military routine. He stops beside the chair without sitting down. "You understand," he says carefully, that things may be different. The sentence hangs unfinished between them. Not hostile. Not welcoming. Simply unfinished. Alfred lifts his eyes toward the man with calm steadiness. Different from what? For the first time that morning, the sergeant hesitates openly. The building itself seems to pause with him. Typewriters continue somewhere deeper in the office. Papers still shift across desks. A truck outside releases its brakes with a long hiss of compressed air drifting faintly through the windows. Yet the small space between these two men feels briefly separated from all of it, suspended inside a question the Corps has avoided confronting for generations. Finally, the sergeant exhales softly through his nose. Different from how things have usually been done. Alfred nods once. I figured that already. No confrontation follows. No speech. No dramatic declaration capable of fitting neatly into history books later on. Only recognition, quiet and restrained, that both men understand something larger has entered the room with them. Not resolution. Not progress completed. Simply movement beginning where stillness existed before. The sergeant places the file carefully onto the desk beside him. Training transport leaves tomorrow morning. Outside, dawn finally reaches the city in full. Light settles across the windows in pale grey layers while engines grow louder in the streets beyond the building. Somewhere nearby, a train horn echoes through the cold morning air before fading slowly into distance. Men continue entering the recruiting station carrying papers, cigarettes, folded newspapers, small suitcases. The war keeps moving forward through routine and repetition, pulling entire institutions behind it whether they are ready or not. And inside this narrow office smelling of ink and radiator heat, the Marine Corps begins, slowly, reluctantly, almost quietly enough to miss, reopening a door it had kept closed for generations. The closed door. The train station smells of coal smoke and damp will long before the first departures of the morning begin. Porters move slowly beneath hanging lamps that cast weak amber circles across the platform, their footsteps softened by soot gathered over years of steam and winter grime. Somewhere farther down the tracks, an engine exhales into the cold with a deep metallic sigh that rolls beneath the station roof before dissolving into the dark. Newspapers arrive bundled in rough twine beside crates marked for military transport. Uniformed men drift through the station carrying duffel bags and folded orders while the city beyond remains half asleep beneath the pale edge of dawn. You stand near the far end of the platform where the light weakens into shadow between iron columns blackened by decades of smoke. The station feels suspended between ordinary civilian movement and the expanding machinery of war. Families embrace briefly beside departing trains. Conductors check tickets beneath pocket watches held close to the light. Somewhere nearby, a woman folds a handkerchief carefully before placing it back inside her coat pocket without speaking. Alfred waits alone beside a narrow bench positioned near the boarding gate reserved for military transport. His suitcase rests upright beside his boots, worn at the corners from years of handling. A folded newspaper sits unopened beneath one arm while steam drifts past the platform in slow white currents each time another locomotive settles pressure along the tracks. Around him, soldiers heading toward training depots speak quietly in small groups about assignments, whether rumors carried between bases already overcrowded with wartime expansion. Their voices rise and fall beneath the station roof without urgency. No one seems entirely certain what shape the war will eventually take. Only that it continues widening. The Marine Corps widens with it, though less comfortably than other branches of service. The Army adapts through scale. The Navy through necessity. But the Marines have always treated themselves differently. Smaller, older, more tightly bound to tradition and identity. Certain assumptions settled deeply into the core over generations, reinforced through repetition until they hardened into something resembling permanence. Black Marines had once existed in American history. Then gradually they did not. Absence became policy so slowly that many inside the institution stopped recognizing it as policy at all. Now the war presses against that silence from every direction. You can feel it even here, inside a station filled with steam and low conversation. New directives move through the military faster than old certainties can comfortably absorb them. Recruitment offices adjust procedures. Barracks prepare separate accommodations. Officers receive instructions phrased carefully enough to sound administrative rather than transformative. The institution continues speaking in the language of routine while history rearranges itself quietly beneath the paperwork. A whistle cuts sharply through the platform. The transport train begins backing slowly into position beside the boarding area, steel wheels grinding softly against wet rails beneath clouds of steam drifting upward toward the station roof. Men gather their bags instinctively. Conversations shorten. Porters step aside as military police move toward the platform entrance, checking papers beneath the weak station lamps. Alfred removes folded orders from inside his coat and studies them once more beneath the light. Montford Point. The words sit plainly on the page without explanation attached to them. A separate training facility. Newly established. Temporary, according to some reports. Necessary, according to others. The Corps avoids speaking openly about why the camp exists in the form it does. Official language prefers practical phrasing over uncomfortable honesty. Separate accommodations. Special training arrangements. Wartime adjustments. Bureaucracy has always possessed a talent for disguising emotional realities inside administrative terms. Nearby, two young Marines already assigned to another training depot glance briefly toward Alfred before lowering their voices. "You heard where they're sending them?" one asks quietly. The other shrugs beneath his heavy coat. "Heard it's down near Lejeune somewhere. They building a whole separate camp." "So they say." The conversation ends there. Not hostile. Not curious enough to continue. Just another small fragment of institutional adjustment passing quietly through ordinary wartime movement. The train doors open with heavy metallic clanks along the platform. Steam drifts low around the wheels while conductors begin checking boarding assignments one passenger at a time. Alfred lifts his suitcase and steps forward with the others moving toward the cars. Boots strike damp concrete in steady rhythms beneath the station roof. Orders are handed over. Names checked against lists already smudged from repeated handling. The process moves efficiently now that the decisions have already been made somewhere far above the platform itself. Still, you notice the hesitation when Alfred's papers change hands. Not surprise anymore. Recognition. The conductor studies the assignment destination for half a second longer than necessary before returning the papers without comment. Another pause too brief to challenge directly, yet long enough to feel. Alfred accepts the documents calmly and boards the train without altering expression. Inside the car, the windows tremble faintly as the engine pressure builds outside. Rows of narrow seats stretch beneath dim overhead lights already dulled by tobacco smoke and long use. Men settle bags into overhead racks while the train releases another deep mechanical breath through the station. Somewhere near the rear compartment, laughter rises briefly before fading again beneath the low murmur of conversation and steam. Then, slowly, the train begins carrying them south toward a place the Marine Corps built because history had returned before the institution fully understood how to receive it. The countryside unfolds slowly beyond the train windows once the city disappears behind them. Factories give way to narrow fields silvered by early frost. Telephone poles pass in steady intervals beside the tracks, their wires rising and falling gently against a pale morning sky still carrying the last traces of dawn. Inside the carriage, the air grows warmer as coal heat spreads unevenly through the compartments. Condensation gathers faintly along the corners of the glass where cold air presses against the windows from outside. Most of the men settle quickly into silence after departure. Some sleep with caps lowered over their eyes while the motion of the train rocks gently beneath them. Others stare outward at passing farmland without really watching it, thoughts already drifting ahead toward camps they have never seen and routines they cannot yet imagine. Cigarette smoke hangs low beneath the ceiling lamps despite the occasional complaint from conductors moving through the aisles checking transport papers. Alfred sits near the center of the carriage with his suitcase tucked carefully beneath his knees. The rhythmic movement of the train travels continuously through the floorboards and into the seat frame beneath him. Metal wheels strike the rails with soft repetitive clacks that gradually flatten time into something measured less by hours than by distance covered. You watch him unfold the newspaper he carried onto the platform earlier that morning. Most of the headlines concern the war overseas now. Naval losses. Production quotas. Reports from the Pacific. Recruitment drives expanding across nearly every branch of the military. The language of the articles feels urgent even when the tone remains controlled. Entire nations are reorganizing themselves around fuel, steel, movement, replacement. Somewhere inside that immense restructuring, old boundaries begin weakening under pressures larger than tradition alone can comfortably contain. Yet institutions rarely surrender those boundaries gracefully. Farther down the carriage, two Marines already in uniform discuss previous assignments in low voices roughened by cigarette smoke and lack of sleep. One mentions Camp Lejeune. The other laughs quietly about endless mud and mosquitoes thick enough to coat the air after sunset. Neither mentions Montford Point directly, though the silence surrounding the name itself feels noticeable now that Alfred has seen it written plainly on his orders. The train slows briefly while passing through a small junction town where freight cars loaded with military supplies sit waiting beside the tracks. Crates stamped with ammunition markings. Fuel drums secured beneath tarps. Flat cars carrying trucks still wrapped in protective canvas. Everywhere the war expresses itself through accumulation. You begin noticing how much of military life depends upon systems remaining invisible to the people they carry. Rail schedules. Forms. Barracks assignments. Segregated facilities constructed quietly at the edges of larger bases. The Marine Corps has not reopened its doors all at once. It has done so administratively, cautiously, through paperwork that allows transformation to disguise itself as logistics. Official memoranda pass between offices using language stripped carefully of emotion. The institution avoids acknowledging the deeper significance of what it is doing even while actively doing it. And perhaps that is why the atmosphere around Alfred feels so restrained. No one inside this train behaves as though history is occurring nearby. The conductors punch tickets. The porters carry coffee through the aisles in metal containers that rattle softly whenever the train shifts direction. Men sleep. Smoke. Read. Wait. Yet beneath the ordinary movement of transport, an older silence begins loosening itself from the structure of the core, one quiet decision at a time. By midday the clouds thin slightly above the countryside. Sunlight finally reaches the windows in pale winter strips that slide slowly across the carriage floor with the motion of the train. Alfred closes the newspaper and rests it beside him while watching the landscape drift past beyond the glass. Pine forests replace open farmland now. Marsh water glints faintly between dark tree lines. Small stations appear and vanish almost immediately along the route south. At one stop, Several new passengers board carrying sea bags marked with marine insignia already faded from use. Their uniforms suggest prior service rather than fresh enlistment. One of them pauses briefly beside Alfred's seat while searching for space in the overhead rack. "You heading to Montford too?" the man asks. Alfred nods once. The Marine studies him for a moment, then glances toward the folded orders visible beside the window. "Heard they built the place fast," he says quietly. "Whole separate side of camp." Neither man answers immediately after that. The train continues forward beneath the long mechanical rhythm of steel against rails. Somewhere farther ahead, another whistle echoes through the forests before fading again into distance. The older Marine eventually secures his bag overhead and lowers himself into the seat across the aisle with the exhausted heaviness of someone already familiar with military movement. After several minutes, he speaks again without looking up. "War changes things." The sentence hangs loosely between them, unfinished in the same way so many wartime conversations seem unfinished now. Not optimistic. Not bitter. Merely observational. Alfred turns slightly toward the window again. "Sometimes," he says softly, "it only changes what people can no longer avoid." Outside, the train pushes deeper into the American South while afternoon light settles quietly across the passing forests. And somewhere beyond those trees, near the expanding coastline camps of the Marine Corps, a separate piece of the institution waits to receive men it had once trained itself not to see at all. Separate ground. The buses arrive before sunset. They wait beyond the small station in uneven rows coated with road dust and dried mud, engines idling heavily beneath the cooling evening air. Military police stand near the loading area checking names against transport lists while drivers smoke cigarettes beside the open doors, their uniforms carrying the faded exhaustion of men who have already repeated this route too many times to remember individual faces anymore. The station itself feels temporary, overwhelmed by the scale of wartime movement passing through it each day. You step down from the train platform into air warmer than the northern cities left behind that morning. The South carries a different texture even in winter. Pine resin drifts faintly through the breeze beyond the station yard. Moisture hangs low above the ground despite the cooling dusk. Somewhere beyond the trees, insects continue their steady evening rhythm while freight trains groan along distant tracks hidden behind warehouses and supply depots spreading outward from the coast. Alfred joins the line forming beside the nearest transport bus. Duffel bags rest near boots coated with cinders from the train platform. Men speak quietly now, fatigue settling heavily across the group after long hours confined inside the rail cars. Some stare toward the darkening highway ahead while others unfold transfer orders once more beneath the weak station lamps as though rereading the paperwork might somehow explain what waits for them beyond the next set of gates. Montford Point. The name still appears strangely temporary on the documents. Less like a historic installation than a solution assembled quickly beneath wartime pressure. And in many ways, that is exactly what it is. The Marine Corps did not spend decades preparing to reopen itself to black Marines. It arrived there reluctantly, through executive orders, labor shortages, political pressure, and the growing realities of global war. Even now, many officers continue treating the entire experiment as provisional, something to be managed administratively rather than embraced institutionally. The buses fill slowly. Canvas seats creak beneath shifting weight while windows rattle faintly each time another passenger climbs aboard. Alfred settles near the center beside the aisle, his duffel positioned carefully between his boots as the vehicle vibrates beneath the idle engine. Outside, the remaining daylight drains gradually from the station yard until only the lamps remain, casting pale circles across the pavement where diesel fumes drift through the cooling air. Finally, the convoy begins moving. The buses roll southward along narrow roads bordered by pine forests and stretches of marshland darkening beneath the evening sky. Headlights sweep across telephone poles and roadside ditches filled with stagnant water reflecting brief strips of light before vanishing again into darkness. Inside the bus, conversation fades almost completely. The long day has reduced most men into silence measured by engine vibration and passing miles. You watch Alfred study the road ahead through the dusty glass. Every few miles another military convoy passes in the opposite direction. Supply trucks, fuel transports, troop carriers moving beneath blackout restrictions that leave only narrow slits of light visible against the dark highway. The entire region feels consumed by expansion. Bases growing outward through forests. Roads widened for transport traffic. Barracks constructed faster than the land itself can comfortably absorb them. Then the first signs of Camp Lejeune begin appearing along the roadside. Fences, guard posts, warehouses rising behind tree lines, floodlights illuminating muddy roads cut recently through the pine forests. The scale of the base reveals itself gradually rather than all at once, spreading across enormous stretches of coastal land reorganized entirely around the machinery of war. Trucks move continuously between depots. Searchlights drift across low clouds. Rows of barracks emerge beyond the trees beneath harsh electric lighting that makes the surrounding darkness feel even deeper. For a moment, some of the men aboard the bus lean slightly toward the windows. This is the Marine Corps they imagined. Large, established, certain of itself. Then the convoy turns away from the main road. The paved route narrows quickly into rougher ground where fresh construction cuts through mud and standing water at the edges of the forest. The buses jolt violently through deep ruts left by recent rain and heavy transport traffic. Floodlights grow fewer here. The roads less finished. Wooden signs appear beside intersections marked hastily with painted lettering already beginning to peel in the damp coastal air. Montford Point. The camp emerges slowly from the darkness. New barracks standing on uneven ground. Fresh lumber still pale beneath the floodlights. Drainage ditches filling with black water beside unfinished roads. Telephone lines sagging between poles planted too recently into soft soil. The place does not yet feel permanent. It feels assembled under pressure, built quickly enough to satisfy necessity while remaining emotionally separate from the institutions surrounding it. Inside the bus, no one speaks as the convoy rolls deeper into the camp. The Marines had reopened the door, but they had not yet decided how close that door should stand to the rest of the Corps. The buses stop beside a row of barracks lit by exposed flood lamps humming softly against the night. For several seconds, no one moves. The engines continue idling beneath the silence while warm diesel fumes drift through the open windows into the crowded interior. Outside, the camp feels unfinished in ways difficult to ignore. Mud spreads across nearly every visible surface beyond the gravel paths. Construction materials remain stacked beside half-cleared lots where more buildings will eventually stand. Somewhere farther off, hammers still strike wood despite the late hour, the sound carrying faintly through the damp coastal darkness. Then the doors fold open. Cold air mixed with marsh moisture enters the bus all at once. The men step down slowly onto ground softened by recent rain and weeks of heavy transport traffic. Boots sink slightly with each movement. Duffel bags shift against tired shoulders. Floodlights cast long shadows across the camp while generators rumble somewhere beyond the nearest rows of buildings. The atmosphere holds the strange tension of a place still becoming itself. You watch Alfred pause briefly after stepping onto the road. Not dramatically, just long enough to absorb the scale of what surrounds him. Montford Point is not hidden exactly. But neither is it fully integrated into the larger world expanding beyond the forests toward Camp Lejeune proper. Distance has been built deliberately into the geography itself. Separate roads. Separate barracks. Separate mess halls. The arrangement speaks quietly through logistics rather than declarations. The Marine Corps has allowed Black Marines to return. But carefully. At controlled distance. A corporal carrying a clipboard begins assigning barracks numbers beneath the floodlights. His voice remains brisk from exhaustion more than authority as names are checked against typed rosters dampened by the coastal air. Barracks C. Barracks D. Second platoon over there. The men disperse gradually into the night, carrying bags through mud that pulls against their boots with wet-sucking sounds. Nearby, trucks loaded with lumber crawl past toward another unfinished section of camp where work crews still move beneath portable lights. The entire installation feels temporary despite the military order imposed upon it. Structures built quickly enough to satisfy wartime demand, yet not slowly enough to suggest permanence or belonging. Alfred follows the line toward a long wooden barracks raised slightly above the ground on fresh supports already stained dark by moisture and mud. The boards creak beneath the weight of entering Marines while warm stale air spills outward through the open doorway carrying the mixed smell of wet canvas, soap, tobacco, and damp wool uniforms drying near portable heaters. Inside, rows of metal bunks stretch beneath low ceilings crossed by exposed beams still pale from recent construction. The room hums softly with exhaustion. Some men unpack quietly beside their assigned bunks while others sit motionless for a few moments before gathering the energy required to remove boots or loosen collars stiff from travel. Somewhere near the rear wall, laughter rises briefly before fading again into the steady rhythm of settling movement. Lockers opening, duffels dropped onto mattresses, springs creaking beneath shifting weight. Alfred places his belongings carefully onto the lower bunk nearest the center aisle. Across from him, another recruit studies the room with tired eyes while rolling a cigarette between rough fingers stained faintly with engine grease from civilian work left behind before enlistment. "Whole place smells like fresh lumber," the man mutters quietly. "And mud," someone farther down the row answers. A few tired chuckles move through the barracks before silence settles again. You notice how quickly routines begin forming even inside uncertainty. Wet coats hung near the same hooks. Boots aligned beneath bunks. Towels draped beside heaters where steam rises faintly into the dim overhead light. Military life reorganizes space almost immediately, imposing order before comfort has time to arrive. Yet beneath that growing rhythm, another awareness lingers constantly inside the room. Everyone here understands what this place represents. Not openly, perhaps. Few men possess the energy for speeches after transport days this long. But the knowledge remains present anyway, moving quietly beneath ordinary conversation. The camp exists because the Corps could no longer maintain absence completely, and because it could not fully accept integration either. So Montford Point becomes compromise made physical, a reopening contained within separation. Outside, the night deepens around the camp. Wind moves softly through the surrounding pines while distant generators continue their endless mechanical hum beyond the barracks walls. Somewhere farther away, almost too distant to hear clearly, another sound drifts faintly across the darkness. Artillery training from the larger marine installations beyond the forest. Low concussions rolling through the coastal air before fading again into silence. The rest of the Corps is out there. Larger. Older. Established. Here, at Montford Point, something newer and more uncertain struggles into existence beneath floodlights and unfinished roads. Alfred removes his jacket slowly and folds it with practiced care beside the bunk. Around him, the barracks continues settling toward sleep, one exhausted movement at a time. Boots removed. Lamps dimmed. Voices lowered until they become almost impossible to distinguish from the wind outside. Then, gradually, the room quiets completely. Only the sounds of breathing remain. And somewhere beyond the walls, construction continues through the night. The routine of separation. Morning begins at Montford Point through whistles and generator noise. The sound cuts across the barracks before daylight fully arrives, sharp enough to pull exhausted men upward from shallow sleep almost instantly. Blankets shift. Springs creak beneath hurried movement. Boots strike the wooden floor in uneven rhythms while cold air slips through the gaps around the windows carrying the smell of wet earth and pine resin from outside. Somewhere beyond the walls, engines already idle in the darkness preparing transport trucks for another day of movement across the expanding camp roads. You watch the room wake itself through routine rather than conversation. Most of the men move quietly at this hour, conserving energy for whatever waits beyond formation lines and training fields once the day fully begins. Towels hang damp beside portable heaters struggling against the coastal chill. Razors scrape softly over metal wash basins in the adjoining room while water pipes groan beneath the strain of too many barracks pulling from temporary systems installed faster than the camp itself can properly settle into the land. Alfred dresses beside his bunk beneath weak overhead lights that flatten every shadow inside the room. Uniform adjusted carefully. Boots laced tight against mud that will inevitably swallow them again before noon. Around him, the atmosphere already feels more organized than it had the night before. Men know where to stand now. Which aisles remain clear. Which lockers stick when opened too quickly. Military order spreads rapidly once repetition begins reinforcing itself. Outside, the camp emerges slowly from darkness. Floodlights still burn near the motor pools where mechanics move between trucks coated with layers of dried mud from previous days of transport work. Water gathers in long black strips along the roads reflecting pale hints of dawn beginning to form behind the tree line. The barracks stand in disciplined rows against the soft marsh landscape, their fresh lumber already weathering beneath salt air and constant moisture. Then the formation whistle sounds again. The Marines step into the cold. Lines form across the muddy parade ground beneath a sky still suspended between night and morning. Breath hangs visible in the air while instructors move along the rows correcting spacing with clipped efficiency. Somewhere beyond the camp perimeter, artillery practice from the larger marine installations rolls faintly through the distance like approaching weather. The sound never fully disappears here. It simply rises and falls throughout the day, a constant reminder that Montford Point exists beside the Corps rather than fully within it. The drill instructor stops briefly in front of Alfred's row. His campaign hat casts a hard shadow across his face beneath the floodlights while damp air gathers along the collar of his coat. He studies the line carefully without speaking at first. Boots aligned. Shoulders squared. Eyes forward. "You are Marines now," he says eventually, voice carrying evenly across the formation. "But don't mistake that for ease." The words settle heavily into the cold morning air. No one moves. The instructor continues pacing slowly through the mud before turning back toward the assembled lines. The Corps expects discipline, precision, endurance. You will be watched closely. Some men are waiting for you to fail. Some are waiting to decide what you represent. None of that changes the standard. He pauses briefly beside another row where one recruit struggles to keep still against the cold. The standard remains the standard. You can feel the atmosphere tighten slightly around the formation after that. Not fear exactly. Awareness. The men here understand something larger sits behind every inspection and drill. Mistakes will not belong solely to individuals. Success may not fully belong to them either. That pressure becomes part of the routine almost immediately. The morning exercises begin beneath skies finally turning grey with dawn. Boots churn the parade ground into deeper mud as platoons move through synchronized drills repeated until movements lose individuality entirely. Left turn. Forward march. Halt. Repeat. Instructors correct posture, timing, spacing, tone. Precision matters here because the institution itself remains unconvinced enough to demand perfection before comfort. Alfred moves through the exercises with controlled steadiness. Not exceptional enough to draw unnecessary attention. Not uncertain enough to invite correction repeatedly. Around him, the camp settles deeper into the rhythm of separation disguised as military order. Mess halls. Training grounds. Barracks. Roads leading outward toward larger marine installations few men here will enter freely except through assigned duty. The Corps has reopened the door. But it still controls every hallway beyond it. By midday, the camp has already changed shape beneath the weight of repetition. The parade grounds dissolve into churned earth under hundreds of boots moving through synchronized drills hour after hour. Mud clings heavily to trouser cuffs and hardens along the seams of leather boots before softening again beneath standing water gathered in shallow depressions across the field. Instructors continue pacing through the formations with relentless attention to detail while the weak winter sun struggles to break through layers of low coastal cloud drifting inland from the Atlantic. You begin noticing how thoroughly military routine controls the body before it controls the mind. Meals arrive at fixed intervals. Marches begin and end according to whistles rather than fatigue. Beds must be aligned identically regardless of who sleeps in them. Every object inside the barracks occupies assigned space measured almost precisely enough to erase personality from the room itself. The Corps reduces uncertainty through repetition until movement becomes instinctive. And yet uncertainty remains everywhere beneath the surface. Alfred feels it most clearly during the transitions between routines. The pauses before entering mess halls. The silence when passing white Marines assigned to transport duty near the outer roads of camp. The careful neutrality maintained by officers visiting from the main installations beyond the forest. Montford Point exists inside the Marine Corps while remaining emotionally outside it, and everyone here understands the distinction even when no one speaks it aloud directly. The mess hall smells of coffee, boiled vegetables, damp wool, and wet timber swelling slightly beneath the coastal moisture. Long rows of tables stretch beneath exposed rafters darkened already by heat and steam rising from the kitchen. Tin trays scrape against counters while cooks move quickly through narrow aisles serving food with the mechanical rhythm wartime feeding requires. The room fills with noise once the platoons arrive, boots against floorboards, chairs dragging across wood, dozens of conversations rising and falling beneath the constant hum of generators outside. Alfred sits near the center of one table beside several recruits from his platoon. Most of the conversation remains practical at first. Blisters. Rifle drills scheduled for the following morning. Rumors about additional construction farther south near the shoreline. One recruit complains quietly about the mud-swallowing boots faster than supply can replace them. Another laughs softly about a corporal who managed to slide face first into a drainage ditch during morning exercises. The laughter helps. Not because it erases the pressure surrounding the camp, but because it interrupts it briefly. Humor survives easily inside military environments where exhaustion leaves little room for formal tension to sustain itself continuously. Men begin learning one another through small habits before deeper trust fully forms. Who snores, who writes letters every evening, who hoards cigarettes, who keeps uniforms impossibly clean despite the mud coating everything else. Across the mess hall, a radio crackles faintly beside the kitchen entrance. News from overseas filters into the room between bursts of static. Naval movements in the Pacific. Bombing raids over Europe. Production targets exceeded in northern factories. The war feels impossibly large compared to the narrow routines of Montford Point, yet every tray carried across this hall connects indirectly to those distant battlefields. Fuel. Training. Discipline. Preparation. Entire lives reorganized toward conflicts unfolding across oceans most men here have never seen. You watch Alfred listening quietly while the conversations around him drift between ordinary frustrations and larger uncertainties none of them fully understand yet. Some recruits speak optimistically about proving themselves worthy of the uniform. Others sound more cautious, already sensing that competence alone may not dissolve the barriers surrounding the camp. The atmosphere remains suspended somewhere between pride and guarded realism. Then the room quiets unexpectedly. Not completely. Just enough for attention to shift toward the entrance. Several white Marine officers have entered beside a logistics sergeant carrying folders beneath one arm. Their uniforms appear cleaner than most of the men seated inside the hall, their boots less marked by the camp roads outside. One officer glances slowly across the crowded room before speaking quietly to the kitchen supervisor near the serving line. The interaction lasts less than a minute. Yet the silence that follows it lingers longer. Conversations eventually resume, though softer now. A few men lower their eyes toward untouched food cooling on tin trays. Others continue eating without visible reaction at all. Alfred remains still beside the table, posture calm, expression unreadable beneath the weak overhead lights humming above the hall. The officers leave as quickly as they arrived. And somehow their brief presence says more about Montford Point than any speech could have managed. The Corps is watching, evaluating, measuring whether reopening the door will remain temporary wartime necessity or become something harder to close again once the war eventually ends. Outside, afternoon settles heavily across the camp. Trucks continue grinding through mud beyond the mess hall windows while construction crews hammer new barracks into existence beneath skies already darkening toward evening again. And across Montford Point, the routine of separation continues deepening into ordinary life one repeated day at a time. The edge of the base. The roads beyond Montford Point dry unevenly after several days without rain. Mud hardens first along the higher ground near the supply depots while the lower stretches remain soft beneath truck traffic heavy enough to carve permanent grooves into the earth. Dust begins replacing moisture across parts of the camp now, lifting into the air behind transport convoys and settling slowly over barracks roofs, laundry lines, and stacks of construction lumber waiting beside unfinished roads. Winter along the Carolina coast never fully commits itself to cold. The land hovers constantly between dampness and dust, between standing water and dry earth cracking beneath military weight. You stand near the transport yard just after dawn watching trucks prepare for movement toward the main installations beyond the forest. Engines idle heavily beneath pale morning light while drivers secure canvas coverings against cargo beds loaded with crates, fuel drums, replacement parts, and bundled supplies marked for distribution across the wider marine network spreading through Camp Lejeune. Mechanics move between the vehicles carrying clipboards already stained dark by grease and fingerprints. Somewhere nearby, a radio crackles through bursts of static before disappearing beneath engine noise again. Alfred waits beside one of the trucks with several other Marines assigned to temporary transport detail. The assignment feels small compared to the grand language often surrounding military service. No battle. No ceremony. Simply movement of supplies between sections of the base expanding too quickly for its own infrastructure to keep pace. Yet details like this matter deeply inside wartime institutions. Entire operations depend upon roads remaining open, fuel arriving on schedule, equipment repaired before failure spreads outward through the larger system. A corporal walks slowly along the line checking assignments. "You'll unload near Depot 6, he says without looking up from the clipboard. "Stay with your vehicle. No wandering around the main base unless instructed." The warning arrives casually. Too casually. No one responds. The Corps rarely states separation directly when implication accomplishes the same task more efficiently. The convoy departs shortly afterward beneath low skies streaked pale gold by the rising sun. Trucks grind through the outer roads of Montford Point before reaching the broader paved routes connecting the larger sections of Camp Lejeune beyond the trees. Dust lifts behind the convoy in long drifting clouds that settle slowly across the roadside pines once the vehicles pass. As the camp opens outward around them, the difference in scale becomes impossible to ignore. The main marine installations stretch across enormous sections of coastline and forest now transformed entirely by wartime expansion. Long rows of permanent barracks. Large parade grounds. Warehouses broad enough to swallow entire convoys beneath their steel roofs. Communication towers rising above the tree line. Rail spurs feeding directly into supply depots where cranes unload military freight day and night without pause. This is the Marine Corps as institution. Confident. Entrenched. Certain of its own continuity. Montford Point had felt provisional. This place feels permanent. You notice the silence among the men riding in the back of the truck as they pass through the larger base roads. White Marines move between buildings carrying rifles, toolkits, field packs. Some glance briefly toward the convoy before continuing on without expression. Others stare longer, curiosity restrained carefully behind military composure. The convoy itself continues forward without slowing. Alfred sits near the rear gate beside stacked supply crates while wind presses against his jacket collar. The separation surrounding Montford Point feels different out here. Less visible. More ambient. No fences announce it directly. No signs explain where boundaries begin. Yet everyone seems to understand them instinctively anyway. Where certain roads lead, which barracks belong to whom, which spaces permit presence and which merely tolerate it temporarily. The truck slows near a fuel depot surrounded by storage tanks painted dull gray against the pale winter sky. Marines begin unloading cargo in practiced rhythm. Crates passed hand to hand. Fuel manifests checked against delivery sheets clipped to metal boards. Forklifts rumble between the loading platforms while trains groan somewhere beyond the warehouses carrying more equipment inland from the ports. The war consumes material endlessly. Oil, rubber, steel, bodies, and institutions adapt around consumption faster than around equality. At one point, Alfred lifts a crate beside another marine mechanic working near the depot entrance. The man looks older than most of the recruits at Montford Point, his sleeves rolled high enough to reveal forearms darkened by engine grease worked deep into the skin over years of maintenance labor. "You from the Point?" the mechanic asks quietly. Alfred nods once. The mechanic studies him briefly, then glances toward the surrounding depot activity before lowering his voice slightly. "Whole place got people talking." "About what?" The older Marine shrugs faintly. "About whether this is temporary." Nearby, a forklift backfires loudly enough to interrupt the conversation for several seconds. The mechanic wipes his hands against a rag hanging from his belt before speaking again. "War changes what people can afford to resist," he says. "Question is whether they change back afterward." Neither man answers immediately. Around them, the depot continues operating beneath the endless movement of wartime logistics. Trucks arriving. Crates unloaded. Papers signed. Engines repaired. The core functions through systems too large to stop for reflection very often. Yet somewhere beneath all this movement, uncertainty still lingers quietly inside the institution itself. Not about whether Black Marines can serve. That question is already answering itself through routine. The deeper uncertainty is whether the Corps is prepared to live permanently with the answer once the war no longer forces the issue. The convoy remains at the depot until late afternoon. Hours pass through repetition rather than event. Crates unloaded from trucks. Fuel inventories checked and signed beneath clipboards dampened by coastal air. Replacement tires roll toward maintenance sheds where mechanics work beneath open steel roofs echoing with hammer strikes and engine noise. The war reveals itself differently here than it does at Montford Point. Less symbolic. More industrial. Entire systems moving continuously beneath schedules too large for any single man to fully see. You begin noticing how much the Marine Corps depends upon invisibility. The visible version of the institution lives in recruitment posters and parade grounds, clean uniforms, sharpened discipline, flags lifting above orderly formations. But the Real Corps stretches outward through loading docks, fuel depots, rail schedules, repair yards, warehouses smelling of rope fiber and diesel smoke. Thousands of ordinary actions repeated correctly enough to keep larger operations functioning across oceans. Alfred works quietly beside the transport crew through the long afternoon. Wood splinters gather against his gloves from lifting supply crates marked for artillery training units farther inland. Dust settles across his sleeves whenever forklifts pass too quickly through the depot lanes. Nearby, mechanics crawl beneath transport trucks leaking oil onto concrete darkened already by years of repairs compressed into months of wartime expansion. No one here has much energy left for spectacle. That changes the atmosphere subtly. At Montford Point, every interaction often carries awareness beneath it. Observation, symbolic pressure, institutional caution. Here at the depot, exhaustion competes with prejudice constantly. Supplies still need unloading regardless of opinion. Engines still fail. Fuel still arrives late. The practical demands of war flatten certain distances, even if only temporarily. Toward evening, Alfred joins several Marines carrying inventory sheets toward the central receiving office near the rail spur. The building stands beside the tracks beneath tall floodlights already flickering awake against the approaching dusk. Freight trains move slowly through the depot yard dragging long chains of cargo cars loaded with machinery, ammunition, and bundled steel covered beneath weatherproof tarps. Every surface smells faintly of iron dust, oil, and hot breaks cooling in the coastal air. Inside the office, clerks work beneath rows of hanging lamps while telephones ring continuously along crowded desks. Paperwork flows through the building with almost mechanical velocity. Manifests stamped. Deliveries logged. Routing changes approved and redirected toward new fronts overseas. The war expands faster than the bureaucracy can comfortably absorb it. Yet the bureaucracy continues adapting anyway through endless administrative motion. Alfred waits beside a narrow counter while one clerk reviews the transport forms handed over by the convoy corporal. The man barely looks up at first. Then his eyes pause. Not dramatically. Just long enough for recognition to surface beneath routine. "You're from Montford Point," the clerk says flatly. "Yes." The clerk studies the paperwork again before reaching for another stamp. "Heard they're building more barracks down there." "So they say." Another pause. The stamp comes down sharply against the paper. For a moment it seems the conversation has ended. Then the clerk leans back slightly in his chair, exhaustion softening the edges of his expression. "My brother's with the raiders in the Pacific," he says quietly. Says after enough artillery starts falling, people stop caring much about who's standing beside them. The words drift into the office noise without emphasis. Telephones continue ringing. Typewriters strike paper in steady bursts. Somewhere near the rear loading doors, a forklift horn echoes briefly through the depot yard. The war keeps moving around them, indifferent to the weight carried inside small conversations like this one. Alfred accepts the stamped forms without answering immediately. Then finally, maybe the people near the artillery stop caring first. The clerk gives the faintest hint of a smile before lowering his eyes back toward the next stack of paperwork already waiting on the desk. Outside, evening settles fully across the depot. Floodlights reflect against rail tracks stretching into darkness beyond the warehouses, while cold air moves inland from the coast, carrying the distant sound of ship horns somewhere beyond the ports. The convoy prepares for departure under deepening blue skies streaked faintly with smoke from the rail engines idling nearby. As the trucks pull away from the larger base roads and begin returning toward Montford Point, Alfred watches the permanent structures of Camp Lejeune slowly recede behind the forests again. Concrete depots, established barracks, wide parade grounds, an institution certain of itself. Then gradually the roads narrow once more. Mud replaces pavement. Temporary buildings reappear beneath isolated floodlights. The separation returns almost invisibly, settling back around the convoy like familiar weather. And yet something has changed slightly during the day. Not policy, not structure, only perception. Small enough to deny if necessary, but present anyway. Because the Corps has begun discovering that proximity changes people unevenly, and that once certain assumptions are interrupted by ordinary human routine, they become harder to restore completely to their original form. The weight of observation. The inspection begins before sunrise. Floodlights burn above the parade ground while darkness still holds the edges of the camp beyond the barracks rows. Frost settles thinly across the higher patches of earth where the mud has finally hardened after several dry days, though moisture still gathers in the lower ditches beside the roads. Somewhere near the motor pool, generators hum beneath the cold air while Marines move quietly between buildings carrying rifles already cleaned twice the night before. Montford Point feels unusually still this morning. Even the barracks wake more carefully than usual. Boots are polished longer. Blankets folded tighter. Uniforms brushed repeatedly beneath weak overhead lights that flatten every wrinkle into visible offense. The men understand inspections are never solely about appearance here. They are evaluations layered inside evaluations, every detail carrying symbolic weight larger than itself. You watch Alfred standing beside his bunk while adjusting the collar of his dress uniform beneath the dim barracks lighting. Around him, other Marines move through the same rituals with controlled concentration. Dust brushed from sleeves. Brass checked against reflected light. Boots aligned precisely beneath bunks now stripped so tightly the mattresses resemble flat military surfaces rather than places human beings actually sleep. The room smells faintly of soap, shoe polish, and damp wool heated too quickly beside the portable stoves. No one speaks much. Outside, whistles cut sharply through the darkness. The platoons form along the parade ground beneath floodlights that cast long shadows across the frozen earth. Breath hangs visible in pale currents while instructors pace slowly between the lines inspecting posture before the formal inspection even begins. Somewhere far beyond the camp perimeter, artillery practice rolls faintly through the cold morning air from the larger marine installations beyond the forest. The rest of the Corps is awake too. That awareness settles heavily across the formation. A staff car arrives shortly afterward near the edge of the parade ground, tires crunching lightly against gravel hardened by the cold. Several officers step out beneath the floodlights, their coats dark against the pale morning frost. One carries a clipboard tucked beneath his arm while another studies the assembled formations in complete silence before beginning the slow walk along the rows. The inspection unfolds with exhausting precision. Boots, buttons, rifles, hands, posture. Every detail observed through prolonged silence that forces the men standing at attention to feel each passing second individually. The officers move carefully enough to suggest they are inspecting not merely Marines, but the legitimacy of the experiment surrounding them. Alfred keeps his eyes fixed forward while the inspection party approaches his section of the line. You can hear the faint crunch of frost beneath the officers' boots as they move closer. One officer pauses beside another recruit long enough to adjust the man's rifle sling personally before continuing without comment. Another stops near the end of the formation, questioning a corporal about barracks maintenance schedules and equipment shortages. Then they reach Alfred. The senior officer studies him for several silent moments beneath the floodlights. Not hostility. Not curiosity exactly. Assessment. The kind institutions perform when deciding whether reality still aligns with assumptions carried too long to surrender comfortably. You were assigned transport detail earlier this week, the officer says eventually. Yes, sir. At Depot 6. Yes, sir. The officer nods faintly while continuing to study the line. How was the assignment? The question arrives so unexpectedly that even the surrounding silence seems to tighten around it. Alfred answers carefully. Routine work, sir. The officer's eyes remain on him another second longer. Nothing unusual. No, sir. A pause. Then. That's good. The inspection continues, moving down the formation after that, boots crunching softly through frost while clipboards fill with notes no one else will ever read. Yet something about the exchange lingers behind like breath still hanging in the cold air after speech has ended. Because the question had not truly concerned transport work at all. It concerned friction, reaction, containment. The Corps keeps searching for evidence that reopening the door might destabilize the institution surrounding it. And every ordinary interaction that fails to produce crisis quietly weakens the assumptions beneath that fear. The sun finally begins rising behind the forests east of camp. Light spreads slowly across the parade ground in pale winter strips while frost melts back into damp earth beneath hundreds of boots held perfectly still at attention. Around Montford Point, another day of routine begins assembling itself through whistles, generators, marching cadence, and paperwork moving between offices. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of military order, the pressure of observation continues settling over the camp like another layer of uniform itself, worn constantly, impossible to remove completely, and heavy enough that men begin forgetting what movement feels like without it. The inspection ends, but the feeling of being inspected does not. By late morning, Montford Point has returned outwardly to its ordinary rhythm. Platoons move between drill fields carrying rifles darkened by fresh oil. Mess crews unload supplies behind the kitchens while trucks crawl through the camp road's raising pale dust where the ground has finally dried enough to break apart beneath tires instead of swallowing them whole. Somewhere near the shoreline training area, machine gun fire rattles in controlled bursts before falling silent again. Yet something settles differently across the camp after mornings like this. You can see it in the carefulness of movement. Beds remade tighter than necessary after barracks checks are already complete. Uniforms brushed repeatedly between assignments. Conversations lowered instinctively whenever officers pass nearby. Observation has become part of the atmosphere itself now, not occasional, but constant enough that men begin carrying it unconsciously inside their posture. Alfred feels it most strongly during the quieter hours between drills. That is when awareness has room to return. The rifle range stretches along the outer edge of camp beyond a series of low sandy embankments scarred black by repeated firing practice. Targets stand against the pale winter sky while instructors move behind the firing lines correcting grip, breathing, sight alignment. The air smells of burned powder and cold metal heated briefly by use before cooling again in the coastal wind. Prone positions in the sand. Commands repeated. Rifles cracking in synchronized rhythm. The work becomes almost meditative after enough repetition. Beside Alfred, another Marine reloads carefully before speaking without lifting his eyes from the rifle sights. You ever feel like they're waiting for confirmation? The question arrives quietly enough to blend almost into the sound of bolts sliding back into place along the line. Confirmation of what? Alfred asks. That this was a mistake. Several shots echo sharply across the range before either man speaks again. The instructor walks behind the firing position studying posture through narrowed eyes while wind carries powder smoke slowly toward the dunes near the camp perimeter. Beyond them lies the larger marine world surrounding Montford Point. Roads, depots, training grounds, barracks from which this separate installation remains deliberately apart. The recruit beside Alfred exhales slowly. My father worked rail yards, he says after a while. Whole life. Said some men don't need you to fail big. They just need enough small mistakes to feel justified. The sentence hangs quietly between firing commands. You notice how often conversations at Montford Point move this way now. Not openly political, not dramatic, but observational. Men studying the pressure surrounding them while trying to understand how to live inside it without allowing it to define every movement completely. Alfred adjusts his rifle slightly against the sand. Then you don't give them the mistakes, he says calmly. The recruit lets out a faint laugh through his nose. Seems simple when you say it. It isn't simple. Another firing command cuts across the range. Rifles rise. Shots crack outward toward the targets again. The day continues through repetition after that. Weapons cleaned beneath weak sunlight. Drill formations crossing the parade ground in measured cadence. Equipment inventories checked twice over by corporals carrying clipboards already curling at the edges from moisture and constant handling. Every part of the camp feels engaged in proving something larger than ordinary military competence alone. And perhaps that is what exhausts the men most. Not the labor itself. The awareness attached to it. At other Marine camps, mistakes remain individual. A missed step during drill. A poorly maintained rifle. An untidy barracks inspection. Here, errors feel collective before they even occur. The Marines of Montford Point carry the additional burden of symbolic consequence, whether they asked for it or not. By evening, the coastal wind grows colder. Laundry lines snap softly between the barracks while smoke rises from the mess hall chimneys into skies fading gradually toward blue-grey dusk. Alfred walks alone for a short distance along one of the outer roads after supper, boots crunching lightly over gravel hardened by the day's colder temperatures. From here, the camp looks almost peaceful. Floodlights glowing beside rows of barracks. Voices drifting faintly through open doors. Generators humming steadily somewhere beyond the motor pool. But the separation remains visible too. Beyond the trees, farther inland, the larger marine installations burn brighter against the darkening horizon. More buildings. More roads. More permanence. Montford Point sits at the edge of that world like a question the Corps still has not fully answered for itself. Alfred stops briefly beside the roadside fence where the pine forest begins swallowing the light. Wind moves softly through the branches overhead. Somewhere far away, a train horn echoes across the Carolina night before fading again into distance. The sound lingers longer than expected, a reminder that movement has already begun, and that institutions, once forced to change even slightly, rarely return completely to the shape they held before the door first opened. The camp becomes ordinary. Winter passes almost without announcement along the Carolina coast. The cold never fully disappears, but the sharpness softens gradually until mornings arrive damp instead of frozen. Frost vanishes from the parade grounds. The roads at Montford Point sink once more into mud beneath endless truck traffic and rising humidity drifting inland from the sea. Pine pollen begins coating windowsills and vehicle hoods in pale yellow dust while insects return to the marshes beyond the camp perimeter, their sound thickening slowly through the evenings. Time changes the camp more effectively than speeches ever could. Barracks that once smelled sharply of fresh lumber now carry the layered scent of long occupation, damp canvas, boot polish, tobacco smoke worked deep into the floorboards, soap heating beside crowded washrooms before dawn. Paths between buildings widen naturally through repetition as thousands of boots carve familiar routes into the earth. Men stop checking maps. Stop hesitating at intersections. The camp begins settling into routine hard enough to resemble permanence. You notice the shift most clearly during morning formation. The lines move more cleanly now across the parade ground. Rifles rise in near-perfect synchronization beneath skies turning pale with early spring light. Drill instructors shout less frequently because correction no longer needs constant reinforcement. The Marines of Montford Point have spent enough months beneath observation that military discipline has begun replacing uncertainty almost automatically. Yet observation itself has not disappeared. It has simply become quieter. Alfred senses it in the way visiting officers now study the camp with less visible tension than before. They no longer arrive expecting immediate disorder. Instead, they observe with the cautious interest institutions reserve for realities that have persisted longer than anticipated. The atmosphere surrounding Montford Point is changing from experiment to existence, and that transition unsettles certain assumptions inside the Corps more deeply than open conflict might have. The training grounds stretch wider now beyond the original camp roads. New rifle ranges. Expanded obstacle courses. Vehicle depots growing steadily toward the forests. Construction crews continue raising additional barracks along freshly cleared sections of land where tree stumps still protrude from the mud like broken posts after rainstorms. Every month brings more recruits arriving through the gates carrying duffel bags and uncertainty in equal measure. Alfred watches them during processing assignments occasionally rotated through the administrative buildings near the entrance road. The new arrivals often carry the same guarded stillness he once carried himself during those first mornings inside the recruiting office months earlier. Some stare quietly at the camp as though measuring whether it feels temporary or permanent. Others arrive already exhausted from journeys through stations, buses, and offices where hesitation followed them silently from desk to desk. Now Alfred stands on the opposite side of that process. Not officer. Not authority. Simply someone who has remained long enough for the environment to stop feeling entirely unfamiliar. A young recruit from Chicago struggles with his paperwork one humid afternoon while ceiling fans rotate lazily overhead inside the processing office. "They send everybody here first?" the recruit asks quietly. "For now," Alfred answers. The recruit glances toward the open window where trucks pass slowly through the camp road outside. "You think it'll always stay separate?" The question hangs in the warm air between the turning fan blades. Outside, hammers strike rhythmically against new construction somewhere beyond the motor pool. The camp continues expanding even while uncertainty about its future remains unresolved. Separate infrastructure has a strange way of becoming normalized once enough money, labor, and routine settle into it. Alfred studies the paperwork before answering. I think the Corps is still trying to decide what this place means. The recruit nods slowly, as though the answer confirms something he already suspected. Across the room, another clerk stamps transport forms beside stacks of enlistment records already bending slightly from the humidity. More names arriving every week now. More Marines. More evidence accumulating quietly against the idea that absence can simply be restored once enough people have crossed the threshold. Outside the office, the camp moves steadily through another ordinary day. Laundry lines shifting in warm coastal wind. Truck engines rumbling past rows of barracks. Drill cadence echoing faintly across the parade grounds. The extraordinary has begun disguising itself as routine. And that may be the most powerful change of all. By summer, the heat settles heavily over Montford Point before sunrise even arrives. Air hangs thick inside the barracks through the night, trapping the smell of damp uniforms, floor polish, and sweat dried into canvas after long days on the training fields. Ceiling fans rotate slowly overhead without providing much relief. Men sleep with blankets kicked aside while insects tap endlessly against the screened windows beneath the weak glow of exterior floodlights. The camp no longer feels newly constructed. It feels occupied. Lived inside. Its roads remain rough, its drainage poor, its separation unmistakable. Yet routine has worn the sharpest edges off uncertainty. Men complain now about ordinary things: food, heat, blisters, inspections, assignments, with the familiarity of Marines who expect to remain rather than visitors waiting to see whether the institution will change its mind. You notice this most clearly in the evenings after drill hours end. The spaces between official routines have begun filling with habits that belong to settled communities rather than temporary wartime experiments. Card games near the barracks entrances. Radios balanced on windowsills playing faint music through static drifting across the warm night air. Letters written beneath dim lamps while trucks continue moving somewhere beyond the camp roads toward the larger installations inland. Alfred sits outside the barracks one evening beside several other Marines after mess call. The sky still holds traces of orange beyond the pine trees while mosquitoes drift lazily through the humid air above the drainage ditches. Nearby, laundry lines sway gently between wooden posts beneath the fading light. Somewhere down the road, laughter rises from another barracks before dissolving again into the low mechanical hum of generators. One of the older Marines lights a cigarette and leans back against the steps. "You realize something," he says quietly. No one answers immediately. The man exhales smoke slowly into the thick summer air. They expected this place to feel temporary forever. Several heads turn slightly toward him. He gestures vaguely toward the camp around them. But look at it now. And he is right. Montford Point has developed weight. Not prestige perhaps. Not equality. But presence. The camp now possesses its own rhythms, routines, memories, tensions, friendships, rivalries, exhaustion, discipline. Men arriving here no longer enter complete uncertainty. They enter a place shaped already by those who came before them. That alone changes the emotional structure of the institution surrounding it. Because absence can be erased quietly. Presence is harder to remove once it accumulates enough ordinary life around itself. Across the road, a transport convoy rumbles past toward the supply yards, raising dust into the warm evening light. The drivers barely glance toward the barracks now. Months earlier, many would have stared openly. Some still do occasionally. But repetition has begun dulling novelty. The existence of black Marines inside the Corps no longer produces immediate disruption everywhere it appears. and that normalization may frighten certain parts of the institution more than confrontation ever could. The following week, Alfred receives another temporary assignment near the larger base installations beyond the forest. This time the work involves supply accounting rather than transport detail. Long days spent moving between depot offices where clerks track shipments flowing continuously toward ports, training camps, and overseas staging grounds. The labor feels dull on the surface. Columns of numbers, inventory sheets, fuel reports. Yet dullness itself carries significance now. No speeches greet him. No dramatic resistance blocks his presence. Only ordinary work unfolding inside spaces where his presence once would have seemed impossible. You watch him moving through the depot offices beneath rotating ceiling fans while typewriters chatter endlessly along crowded desks. White Marines pass forms across counters without hesitation now, focused more on deadlines than symbolism. A corporal curses softly about missing fuel manifests. Another complains about delayed rail deliveries from northern factories. The war continues compressing priorities into practicality. Still, the separation never fully disappears. One afternoon Alfred enters a crowded administrative office carrying revised inventory forms while several Marines stand near the rear wall discussing officer assignments. The conversation quiets briefly when he approaches. Not hostile. Reflexive. One of the men nods politely before stepping aside to clear space near the filing cabinets. Then the conversation resumes. Small moments like this happen constantly now. Not enough to stop movement. Not enough to reverse the process already underway. But enough to remind everyone that adaptation remains incomplete. The Corps is learning how to function beside Black Marines before it has fully learned how to emotionally absorb them. And perhaps institutions always change this way, operationally first, psychologically much later. That evening, Alfred returns to Montford Point aboard a crowded transport truck rolling through humid darkness beneath blackout-restricted headlights. The larger marine installations fade gradually behind the forests as the convoy approaches the separate roads leading back toward camp. Floodlights appear again through the trees. Barracks. Mud roads hardened now by months of traffic. Voices drifting through open windows into the summer night. Home, in a sense the Corps had never intended this place to become. And somewhere beneath the sound of engines and insects and distant artillery rolling across the Carolina coast, the impossible has already begun turning ordinary. The Corps adjusts quietly. The changes arrive slowly enough that most men notice them only after they have already become routine. A new transport route opened between Montford Point and one of the larger supply depots inland. Additional training schedules integrated with broader logistical operations across Camp Lejeune. More Black Marines assigned to specialized duties once handled exclusively elsewhere inside the Corps. None of the adjustments arrive with ceremony. They appear through revised paperwork pinned to bulletin boards and new names added quietly to existing rosters. Institutions rarely announce the moment they begin adapting to realities they once resisted. Instead, they reorganize themselves administratively until the new arrangement starts resembling inevitability. Morning heat already presses heavily across the camp when Alfred reports for depot assignment shortly after dawn. The air smells faintly of pine sap warming beneath the rising sun and diesel drifting from transport trucks lined beside the motor pool. Insects move thickly through the drainage ditches while Marines cross the roads carrying rifles, clipboards, fuel manifests, steaming cups of coffee balanced carefully against the humidity. You watch the camp wake itself now with far less uncertainty than before. The younger recruits arriving at Montford Point no longer carry quite the same guarded stillness that defined the earlier months. They still understand the separation surrounding the camp. But many arrive already aware that Black Marines exist inside the Corps now in practical terms rather than theoretical ones. That distinction matters. The psychological burden of being first begins shifting subtly once enough others follow behind. Still, the pressure never disappears entirely. At the depot inland, Alfred spends most mornings moving between warehouse offices where supply clerks work beneath ceiling fans too weak to fully cut through the heat gathering inside the buildings by midday. The war in Europe expands relentlessly now. Pacific operations grow larger. Casualty reports increase. Every week the Corps requires more fuel, more parts, more trained men capable of keeping enormous military systems functioning across multiple continents. Necessity continues wearing away resistance faster than philosophy ever could. Inside one warehouse office, stacked manifests cover nearly every available surface. Boxes of carbines wait beside rail schedules. Spare engine parts lie sorted across work tables already stained black by oil and fingerprints. Telephones ring constantly beneath the slow-turning fans while clerks move through the rooms with the exhausted speed of men who have repeated the same tasks for too many months without pause. Alfred enters carrying revised inventory forms just as a heated argument breaks out near the rear loading doors. "You can't reroute half the shipment now," one sergeant snaps while jabbing a finger toward a clipboard. "The convoy's already scheduled." "The rail delay changed everything," another answers. "You want fuel sitting at the port another week." Nearby Marines glance briefly toward the exchange before returning immediately to their own work. The war has exhausted most people's appetite for drama unless absolutely necessary. Efficiency matters more than pride inside spaces like this. One of the senior clerks notices Alfred waiting beside the filing desk. "Hold on," he mutters distractedly while continuing to sort paperwork. The argument near the loading doors grows sharper for another minute before finally collapsing into resigned frustration. One sergeant storms outside into the heat while the other begins revising transport schedules with irritated movements sharp enough to bend the edges of the paper beneath his hands. Then the office settles again. Telephones resume ringing. Typewriters continue striking. The larger machinery of war absorbs the disruption and moves forward. The senior clerk finally reaches for Alfred's forms. "You from Montford?" he asks absently while scanning the paperwork. "Yes." The man nods without looking up. "My nephew's there now." The sentence arrives so casually that Alfred does not answer immediately. The clerk continues flipping through manifests. "Good kid. Says the drill instructors are harder on them than anybody." "They are." The clerk grunts softly, probably trying to prove something. Around them, the office continues moving through another ordinary wartime morning. Yet the exchange lingers quietly in the air afterward because of how unremarkable it had sounded. No hesitation. No visible discomfort. Only practical conversation between Marines discussing assignments and family. Small moments like this accumulate invisibly over time. And institutions change through accumulation long before they change officially. Outside, the summer heat deepens across the depot yards while trucks continue arriving beneath clouds of dust hanging above the roads. Forklifts rattle between warehouses. Freight trains groan slowly along overloaded rail spurs. The Marine Corps keeps expanding faster than its traditions can comfortably contain. And somewhere inside that expansion, the separate world of Montford Point has begun threading itself quietly into the larger bloodstream of the Corps itself. By late afternoon, the depot settles into the slow exhaustion that follows long hours of uninterrupted wartime routine. The heat lingers heavily inside the warehouses even after the sun begins lowering toward the pine forests beyond Camp Lejeune. Ceiling fans continue turning above crowded offices where clerks loosen collars and wipe sweat from their necks using handkerchiefs already stained with ink and dust. Outside, the roads shimmer faintly beneath layers of powdered dirt churned upward all day by transport convoys moving between depots, rail spurs, and staging grounds spreading endlessly across the coast. You begin noticing how fatigue alters behavior inside institutions. Exhaustion does not erase prejudice cleanly, but it changes priorities. Men carrying too much work for too many months start measuring one another differently. Reliability begins outweighing assumption. Competence becomes harder to ignore when entire systems depend upon it daily. Alfred spends the remainder of the afternoon helping reconcile delayed inventory shipments near the eastern freight sheds beside the rail yard. The work is tedious. Crates counted twice against manifests already revised 3 separate times since morning. Fuel drums redirected toward units preparing for overseas deployment. Engine parts unloaded beneath steel awnings that trap heat and diesel smoke together beneath the low roofs. The war consumes material at a scale almost impossible to fully imagine from inside any single depot. Nearby, a Marine corporal struggles with a damaged forklift stalled beside a loading platform stacked high with ration crates. The machine sputters weakly each time he attempts restarting it. "Damn thing's dead," the corporal mutters while slamming one palm against the steering column hard enough to rattle the frame. Several men glance briefly toward the sound before returning to their assignments. Delays happen constantly now. Engines fail. Tires split. Rail shipments arrive incomplete. Entire wartime systems operate in a permanent state between organization and collapse. Alfred pauses near the edge of the platform while watching the corporal continue fighting the ignition. "You flooding the engine?" he asks quietly. The corporal looks up sharply at first, irritation still visible across his face. Then exhaustion overtakes it. "Maybe," he says. "Or maybe the whole damn thing's finished." Alfred steps closer beneath the warehouse awning where heat hangs thick enough to blur the air above the concrete. "Try it again." The corporal hesitates only briefly before turning the ignition once more. The engine coughs violently, sputters, then stalls again beneath a burst of dark smoke. Alfred listens carefully for a few seconds. Give it a minute before you restart. Let the fuel settle. The corporal studies him uncertainly, then shrugs. At this point in the war, practicality often outruns pride. Around them, depot workers continue unloading freight beneath fading sunlight while trains grind slowly through the yard carrying more cargo inland from the ports. Somewhere beyond the warehouses, a siren sounds briefly to signal another arriving convoy. After several minutes, the corporal tries again. This time the engine catches almost immediately. The forklift vibrates alive beneath a burst of diesel smoke before settling into steady idle. The corporal stares at the machine for half a second longer than necessary before looking back toward Alfred. "Well," he mutters, "guess it wasn't dead." Alfred allows himself the faintest trace of a smile. "No. Just overheated." The corporal nods slowly while adjusting the throttle. Then, almost casually, "You worked engines before the Corps?" "A little." "HM." The Marine shifts the forklift into gear before stopping again briefly. "My brother's shipping out next month," he says without looking directly at Alfred. "Europe, probably." The statement arrives with the strange openness exhaustion sometimes creates between strangers. "Hope he comes back," Alfred answers. The corporal nods once, then drives the forklift back toward the loading platforms where waiting crews immediately begin securing the delayed cargo. No revelation follows the exchange. No sudden friendship. Only another ordinary interaction completed without friction severe enough to reinforce the older assumptions surrounding separation. And that is precisely what begins changing the institution. Not speeches. Not slogans. Routine contact surviving repetition. As evening approaches, the depot gradually empties beneath skies turning copper and grey above the rail yard. Trucks depart in long columns raising dust into the lowering sunlight while clerks close ledger books and secure office windows against the warm coastal night soon gathering beyond the warehouses. Alfred boards the returning transport convoy near dusk. The trucks roll back toward Montford Point through roads lined with pine forests glowing dark green beneath the fading light. Camp Lejeune passes around them once more. Parade grounds, warehouses, officer housing, endless rows of barracks carrying the accumulated certainty of a corps convinced of its own permanence. And somewhere inside that permanence now, however reluctantly, Black Marines have begun occupying ordinary space. Not fully accepted. Not equal. But present enough that the institution can no longer honestly imagine itself without them. The war expands faster than tradition. Autumn returns quietly to the Carolina coast. The heat breaks first during the nights. Windows left open in the barracks no longer pull in thick humid air heavy with insects and marsh water. Instead the wind arrives cooler now, carrying the dry scent of pine needles and distant wood smoke drifting across the camp after sunset. The roads harden temporarily beneath weeks without heavy rain, allowing transport convoys to move faster between Montford Point and the larger installations beyond the forest. The war has grown larger too. Every bulletin board inside the camp now carries maps marked with advancing fronts, island campaigns, casualty estimates, shipping losses. New recruits arrive continuously. Some younger than the men already training them. Others carrying civilian skills the Corps suddenly values because the scale of conflict no longer permits rigid selectiveness in every area it once controlled so confidently. You stand near the edge of the parade ground before dawn watching another intake formation assemble beneath pale floodlights. The routine has become almost automatic now. Names checked. Assignments issued. Bunks filled. Uniforms distributed. The machinery of Montford Point no longer hesitates while processing Black Marines into the Corps. The camp functions too efficiently for uncertainty to interrupt it the way it once did. And perhaps that realization unsettles certain officers more deeply than open resistance ever could. Because temporary systems are not supposed to become stable. Yet stability has arrived anyway. Alfred notices it during drill instruction assignments increasingly rotated through experienced Marines rather than outside personnel. He spends several mornings each week now helping supervise field exercises for newer recruits crossing the same muddy training grounds he once entered carrying uncertainty inside every movement. The younger men study him differently than the earlier groups had studied one another. Not as impossibility. As precedent. That shift matters enormously even if few people say so aloud. The obstacle course stretches across low sandy ground near the edge of camp where pine roots push unevenly through the soil beneath ropes, climbing walls, and trenches dug deep enough to collect stagnant rainwater after storms. Recruits move through the course beneath shouted instructions while dust lifts around their boots in pale clouds glowing beneath the morning sun. One recruit struggles repeatedly at the rope wall near the center of the field. Each attempt ends with boots slipping back against the wood before he can pull himself fully over the top. Nearby instructors continue shouting corrections while the line behind him slows into visible frustration. Alfred steps toward the obstacle without raising his voice. Use your legs more than your arms. The recruit tries again. Fails again. Breathing hard now. You're fighting the wall, Alfred says calmly. Stop fighting it. Climb through the movement. The recruit stares at him uncertainly. You make that sound easy. It isn't easy. Around them, the course continues moving through dust, sweat, shouted cadence, and repeated failure, slowly becoming discipline through exhaustion. The core trains by repetition because repetition strips hesitation from the body before the mind fully understands what changed. Alfred grips the rope himself briefly and demonstrates the movement slowly. Boot placement. Weight shift. Momentum. Nothing dramatic. Just technique refined through practice. The recruit studies him for another second before trying once more. This time he clears the wall. Not gracefully, but successfully. A few men behind him nod instinctively before continuing through the obstacle line. The moment passes almost immediately afterward. The drill resumes. Cadence returns. Dust rises beneath boots crossing the field. Yet you can feel another subtle shift settling into the atmosphere around the camp. Authority has begun transferring itself naturally. Not officially, perhaps, but operationally. The Corps now depends increasingly upon Black Marines to train, stabilize, and sustain the very system once constructed to exclude them. And institutions rarely know how to emotionally process that kind of contradiction while it is still happening. The afternoons grow quieter at Montford Point once the training cycles settle into established rhythm. Not silent. Never silent. Engines still move constantly along the roads. Construction crews continue hammering new barracks into existence near the southern perimeter of camp. Rifles crack across the distant ranges while cadence drifts through the trees from platoons marching somewhere beyond sight. Yet the emotional atmosphere has changed. Earlier months carried tension sharp enough to feel in every interaction. Now the pressure spreads more diffusely across routine itself. You begin noticing how normalization transforms environments before people fully realize it has happened. The mess hall remains crowded. The barracks still overcrowded in places. The separation from the larger marine installations remains physically obvious. But Montford Point no longer feels provisional in the way it once did. The camp has acquired institutional gravity through repetition alone. Men arrive here expecting it to exist. That changes everything. Late one afternoon, Alfred walks toward the shoreline training area beyond the outer roads where coastal wind cuts more sharply across the open ground. The Atlantic lies hidden beyond low dunes and marshland, though the smell of salt water reaches camp easily whenever the wind shifts inland. Training exercises continue near the beach under the supervision of several instructors rotating platoons through amphibious drills increasingly emphasized as Pacific operations expand overseas. The shoreline feels different from the interior sections of camp. Less enclosed. The horizon wider. Sky and water blending together beneath pale autumn light while transport craft sit pulled onto the sand farther down the beach like dark mechanical animals resting between movements. Marines move through surf carrying equipment overhead while instructors shout corrections half lost beneath wind and waves. Alfred pauses beside a supply truck parked near the dunes while recruits struggle through repeated landing exercises in the cold water. One instructor nearby lowers binoculars and wipes salt spray from the lenses using a cloth already damp from repeated use. "Pacific's changing everything," the man mutters without turning fully toward Alfred. The statement sounds less conversational than observational, as though spoken partly to the wind itself. "How so?" Alfred asks. The instructor studies the shoreline for a few moments before answering. Corps can't afford old certainties anymore. Another wave crashes against the landing craft near shore while Marines drag equipment through knee-deep surf beneath shouted timing commands. The instructor continues quietly. Not enough men. Not enough ships. Not enough time. He pauses. War gets expensive. Tradition starts competing with necessity. The sentence settles heavily against the sound of the water. Nearby, one platoon finishes the exercise and begins jogging back toward the dunes soaked nearly to the waist, uniforms darkened by seawater and sand clinging heavily to their boots. Exhaustion strips away many forms of distance temporarily. Men focused on breathing, movement, survival rarely maintain perfect ideological clarity at the same time. You watch Alfred observing the recruits crossing the beach. Many are younger than him now. Some arrived at Montford Point already expecting Black Marines to exist inside the Corps because they had never known the institution before the reopening began. That realization carries strange emotional weight. Entire generations inside military systems can shift almost invisibly once enough routine accumulates around change. And perhaps that is what the Corps failed to anticipate most clearly. Not that Black Marines could serve, but that service, once normalized through repetition, would become increasingly difficult to emotionally isolate forever. Toward evening, Alfred returns inland along one of the outer camp roads where pine forests darken gradually beneath the lowering autumn sun. Trucks continue moving between depots, raising thin clouds of dust that drift slowly through the trees after the convoys pass. Somewhere beyond the forest, artillery practice echoes faintly across the coastline before dissolving into distance. Montford Point appears ahead through the fading light. Barracks. Floodlights flickering awake one by one. Laundry shifting in the evening wind. Smoke rising from the mess hall chimneys. The camp no longer resembles a question waiting to be answered. It resembles an institution already alive. And that changes the emotional balance surrounding the Marine Corps itself. Because once an institution adapts operationally long enough, memory begins adjusting around the adaptation whether leadership intends it or not. The impossible becomes unusual, then ordinary, then expected, and eventually, younger men struggle to imagine the older silence clearly enough to understand why it existed at all. The distance narrows. The winter winds arrive earlier that year. Cold air moves inland from the Atlantic carrying salt, rain, and the sharp metallic smell of approaching storms long before the clouds themselves reach the camp. Barracks windows rattle softly through the night while canvas coverings snap against transport trucks parked beside the motor pools. The roads at Montford Point sink once again beneath mud and standing water after weeks of rain rolling across the Carolina coast in slow gray waves. The camp keeps functioning anyway. It always does. You stand beneath the overhang outside the administrative barracks just before dawn watching headlights move through the rain along the outer roads. Convoys arrive earlier now. More recruits. More equipment. More fuel shipments redirected through Camp Lejeune as the war expands across oceans faster than military infrastructure can comfortably sustain it. The Marine Corps no longer possesses the luxury of controlled experimentation. Necessity has accelerated beyond caution. Inside the administrative office, typewriters already hammer steadily beneath weak yellow lamps. The room smells faintly of wet paper, coffee grounds, and damp wool coats hung beside the radiators struggling against the cold. Clerks move between desks carrying revised assignment sheets while rain taps continuously against the windows in soft, uneven rhythms. Alfred works near the rear records table reviewing transport rosters for incoming personnel transfers. The assignment would have seemed impossible only a short time earlier. Black Marines helping administer portions of the Corps' own expanding machinery. Yet no one inside the office reacts visibly to his presence now. They react to delays, to missing paperwork, to weather slowing convoys, to shortages spreading through supply lines strained by global war. Routine has begun eroding novelty. And novelty was always one of the strongest walls surrounding separation. A lieutenant enters the office carrying a stack of field reports dampened by rainwater. "Road south of Depot 4's flooding again," he mutters toward the nearest clerk. "Convoys delayed at least 3 hours." Another man groans quietly without looking up from his typewriter. "Everything's delayed." The lieutenant drops the reports onto the nearest desk before finally noticing Alfred sorting rosters nearby. "You're Masters, right?" "Yes, sir." The officer nods once. "Heard you handled intake processing during the last transfer cycle." "Yes, sir." "We're short personnel today. Need another pair of hands at the receiving station." The request arrives casually. No hesitation. No visible recalculation. Only wartime practicality continuing its slow work against older assumptions. Alfred gathers the transport forms while rain drums harder against the roof overhead. Outside, the receiving station sits near the edge of camp where buses unload new arrivals beneath floodlights blurred by weather and mist. The station has changed over the months almost as much as the camp itself. What once felt tense and provisional now operates with the exhausted efficiency of a system processing too many men too quickly to sustain emotional friction at full intensity. The buses arrive shortly after sunrise. Doors fold open beneath the rain while recruits step carefully into mud already churned deep by previous convoys. Duffel bags shift across shoulders. Orders protected beneath jackets against the weather. Some men stare toward the camp with the same uncertainty Alfred once carried during his own arrival. But something is different now. The recruits expect Black Marines to meet them here. The sight no longer produces visible surprise. You notice the shift immediately in the rhythm of interaction. Papers handed over without pause. Names checked. Assignments issued. Questions answered. The machinery moves forward cleanly because the people entering it already understand the shape of the institution they are joining. One young recruit hesitates briefly while adjusting his soaked collar near the processing desk. "This your first winter here?" he asks Alfred while waiting for his assignment papers. "No." The recruit glances toward the camp roads disappearing into rain and fog beyond the station. "What's it like?" The question feels larger than the weather clearly being referenced. Alfred studies the rows of barracks barely visible through the storm. "Busy," he answers calmly. "And getting less temporary every month." The recruit nods slowly, then accepts his papers without further hesitation before disappearing into the rain with the others heading deeper into camp. Outside, trucks continue grinding through mud beneath the storm while floodlights glow pale against the grey morning. Montford Point keeps expanding through repetition, necessity, and ordinary endurance. And somewhere beneath the rain and paperwork and endless movement of wartime administration, the distance between separate worlds has already begun narrowing in ways the Corps can no longer fully control. The rain continues for 3 straight days. Water gathers beneath the barrack steps and fills the drainage ditches until entire sections of camp roads disappear beneath brown moving currents churned constantly by truck tires and marching boots. Canvas coverings sag beneath accumulated rainwater before Marines push the pools loose with broom handles each morning. The air smells permanently of wet earth, soaked lumber, diesel smoke, and damp while drying too slowly beside overheated radiators. Montford Point becomes quieter during storms like this. Not less active. Quieter. The camp turns inward beneath the weather. Conversations shorten. Footsteps soften against mud and standing water. Men move quickly between buildings with collars raised while floodlights glow through mist thick enough to blur the edges of the barracks into pale, uncertain shapes after dark. You begin noticing how weather changes institutional behavior. Rain strips environments down to essentials. Convoys slow. Inspections shorten. Officers stop lingering outdoors unless necessary. Practical concerns rise toward the surface, while symbolic tensions recede slightly beneath exhaustion and inconvenience shared by everyone moving through the same storm. Alfred spends much of the third day helping process delayed transfer records inside the receiving station near the camp entrance. The room hums steadily with administrative noise. Typewriters. Boots crossing wet floorboards. Papers sliding across counters already warped slightly by humidity. A coal stove crackles near the rear wall where several soaked Marines hold their hands briefly toward the heat before returning to work. Outside, another convoy finally pushes through the flooded roads shortly before dusk. The buses arrive coated in mud nearly to the windows. Drivers climb down stiffly into the rain while military police wave the vehicles toward unloading points illuminated by weak floodlights reflected across standing water. Recruits begin stepping out carrying wet duffel bags beneath skies already darkening toward evening. One bus stalls near the edge of the unloading area. The engine coughs twice before dying completely. Several Marines glance toward it instinctively. No one seems surprised anymore. The war has pushed every machine beyond comfortable limits. A sergeant curses softly while climbing through the rain toward the driver's compartment. Another man waves impatiently for the remaining recruits to keep moving despite the blockage now slowing traffic through the entrance road. Alfred steps outside beneath the storm. Rain strikes heavily against his jacket while mud pulls at his boots with each movement toward the stalled bus. The driver sits behind the wheel working the ignition repeatedly without success while exhausted recruits wait silently inside the dim vehicle. Flooded? Alfred asks. Maybe fuel line, the driver mutters. Or maybe she's just done. The rain drums loudly against the roof overhead. Nearby Marines continue unloading the other buses while headlights glow through mist and diesel smoke drifting across the flooded road. The entire receiving station feels suspended inside weather and exhaustion thick enough to flatten rank and symbolism alike into simple necessity. Alfred listens to the engine crank once more, then shakes his head slightly. Let it breathe a minute. The driver studies him briefly through the rain-streaked window before finally leaning back from the ignition with visible frustration. For several moments, both men simply listen to the storm. Water rushing through ditches. Boots splashing across flooded ground. Engines idling somewhere farther down the convoy line. The core continues functioning beneath all of it, held together less by certainty now than by constant adjustment. Finally, Alfred nods toward the ignition again. The driver tries once more. This time the engine catches roughly before settling into heavy vibration beneath the bus frame. The driver exhales sharply through his nose. Well, he mutters, guess she's not dead yet. Neither man smiles fully. But the tension eases anyway. The bus pulls slowly forward through the flooded road while recruits continue unloading beneath the storm. Nearby, one of the military police officers watches the exchange for a few silent seconds before returning immediately to directing traffic. No comment. No reaction. Only another ordinary wartime problem solved through ordinary competence. And perhaps that is precisely what continues narrowing the distance between worlds once kept rigidly apart. Not declarations. Accumulation. Thousands of repeated moments too practical to argue with forever. By nightfall, the rain finally begins weakening. Mist drifts across the camp beneath floodlights glowing pale against the wet darkness while Marines return gradually toward the barracks through roads transformed into rivers of mud reflecting strips of yellow light. Somewhere beyond the forest surrounding Montford Point, the larger Marine installations continue operating through the storm as well. Depots, barracks, training grounds, offices, all connected now through systems that increasingly rely upon men the Corps once insisted did not belong inside it at all. And though the separation still exists physically, emotionally it no longer feels as absolute as it once did. Because repetition has worn pathways through the silence. And once people begin depending upon one another inside ordinary routine, distance becomes harder to preserve in its original form forever. The shape of the future. The war begins arriving at Montford Point through absence as much as through arrival. Empty bunks. Transferred platoons. Names removed quietly from duty rosters after deployment orders move men toward ports farther south. The camp still grows overall. More recruits, more barracks, more supply convoys grinding through the roads each week. Yet beneath the expansion, another rhythm now develops alongside it. Marines trained here are leaving the safety of routine behind and entering the wider machinery of war itself. You notice the emotional change immediately. The camp feels older now. Not in years. In weight. Morning formations still unfold beneath whistles and cold coastal air drifting inland before dawn. Drill instructors still pace the lines, correcting posture with clipped precision. Trucks still move endlessly between depots, raising dust or mud depending on the weather. Yet the atmosphere surrounding the Marines has shifted subtly away from proving legitimacy and toward preparing for consequence. The Corps no longer questions whether Black Marines can function inside military structure. Now it needs them to function inside war. Alfred senses the transition during transport assignments increasingly connected to outbound movement rather than local training. Entire platoons process through staging areas carrying sea bags packed tighter than before, their conversations quieter while final paperwork moves between offices already overwhelmed by deployment schedules. The rail station near the coastal transfer yard hums continuously now beneath the pressure of wartime movement. Freight cars loaded with equipment stand beside passenger coaches carrying Marines toward embarkation points farther south. Cranes swing cargo nets above the docks beyond the station while naval horns drift inland through morning fog mixed with salt air and coal smoke. Everywhere the war feels closer than before. You stand near the platform watching Marines board another transfer train beneath skies still pale with dawn. Some smoke silently while waiting beside stacked duffels. Others write hurried final notes against cargo crates before folding the pages carefully into envelopes already damp from the coastal air. Military police move through the station checking manifests while loudspeakers crackle overhead with routing changes and transport updates. Alfred helps load supply inventories near the rear freight section where crates marked for Pacific shipment disappear steadily into the rail cars. The labor keeps hands occupied. That matters. Because idle moments invite reflection too easily now. One young Marine pauses beside the loading platform after securing his gear near the train entrance. "You think the Corps changes after this?" he asks quietly. The question arrives without context because none is needed anymore. After the war. After deployment. After enough men return wearing the uniform under conditions impossible to deny or abstract away again. Alfred studies the freight crews moving through steam and early light before answering. "I think wars change things people wanted to keep unchanged." The Marine nods slowly. But they change back too sometimes. Nearby, a locomotive releases pressure with a long metallic hiss that rolls beneath the station roof before fading into the morning. "Yes," Alfred says calmly. "Sometimes they try." The train begins boarding shortly afterward. Conductors call assignments while Marines climb aboard carrying the accumulated exhaustion of years compressed into months of training, transport, waiting, repetition. Some glance back toward the station briefly before disappearing into the cars. Others avoid looking backward at all. The Corps itself seems suspended between versions of its own future now. One path leads toward restoring older silences once the emergency of war eventually fades. The other leads somewhere less certain, an institution permanently altered by the practical realities it had been forced to live beside long enough that denial no longer feels entirely honest. And perhaps that uncertainty explains the atmosphere settling increasingly across Montford Point. Not optimism. Not triumph. Awareness. The sense that history has already crossed a threshold difficult to uncross completely, even if powerful men eventually attempt it anyway. As the train finally pulls away from the station, steam drifting low across the rails beneath the cold coastal dawn, Alfred watches the departing cars disappear gradually into the forests beyond the camp roads. More Marines leaving now. More evidence carried outward into the wider core itself. And every departure narrows the distance between separate worlds a little further than before. By evening, the station has almost emptied again. Only freight crews remain near the loading platforms, moving through fading light beneath clouds of steam drifting low across the rails. Crates still wait beside the warehouses marked for shipment overseas. Fuel drums stand stacked beneath tarps darkened by salt air and rain. Somewhere beyond the docks, ship horns echo through the coastal fog while cranes continue lifting cargo into transports preparing to leave with the next tide. The war never fully pauses anymore. Even silence feels temporary inside it. Alfred remains near the freight platform helping finalize inventory transfers long after the departing train disappears inland. The work stretches into dusk through repetition familiar enough to feel almost automatic now. Manifests checked against cargo lists, damaged crates resealed, routing corrections signed beneath lamps attracting insects that circle endlessly through the warm evening air. You begin noticing how ordinary responsibility changes perception inside institutions. Months earlier, Alfred's presence at places like this would have drawn prolonged attention simply for existing. Now the depot officers mostly notice whether shipments arrive correctly, whether schedules hold, whether the machinery continues functioning beneath wartime strain. The Corps has not transformed morally overnight, but practical dependence has begun reshaping instinct faster than many men inside the institution realize consciously. Near sunset, Alfred carries revised paperwork toward the administrative shed overlooking the rail yard. The office windows glow softly against the darkening evening while clerks continue typing beneath ceiling fans stirring humid air mixed with coal smoke drifting through the open doors. One officer stands near the rear wall studying transport maps covered in colored pins marking deployments spreading steadily across the Pacific. He looks tired. Everyone does now. The officer glances toward Alfred as he enters. "Leave those there," he says quietly, nodding toward the desk. Alfred places the manifests beside several stacks already waiting for review. For a few moments, neither man speaks. Outside, another freight train grinds slowly through the yard while sparks flash briefly beneath steel wheels against the rails. The office vibrates faintly with the movement. Finally, the officer lowers his eyes from the maps. "You know," he says carefully, "a year ago some people said this whole thing wouldn't hold together." Alfred remains still. The officer gestures vaguely toward the maps, the paperwork, the rail yard beyond the windows. Montford Point. The Corps opening up. Said it had caused more problems than it solved. The room hums softly beneath the ceiling fans. Telephones ring somewhere deeper inside the station office. Clerks continue moving papers from desk to desk beneath weak yellow lamps while the war presses outward endlessly through routes and schedules too large for any one person to fully comprehend. "And now?" Alfred asks. The officer exhales slowly through his nose. "Now most days people are too busy trying to win the war to keep pretending you aren't Marines." The sentence hangs quietly in the office afterward. Not revolutionary. Not poetic. Simply honest in a way institutions rarely allow themselves to become openly. The officer studies the transport maps again before speaking once more. Doesn't mean everybody changed their minds. No, Alfred answers calmly. Probably not. Outside, rain begins lightly against the station roof. Just a soft coastal drizzle moving inland from the sea while floodlights flicker across the wet rails below. The officer nods once, almost to himself. But things stop being theoretical after enough time. That is the real transformation unfolding now. Not sudden enlightenment. Not dramatic reconciliation. Reality hardening through repetition until denial itself becomes more difficult to maintain operationally. Montford Point had once existed as an exception. Now it exists as infrastructure, as routine, as memory already embedding itself into the core whether the institution fully welcomes that memory or not. Later that night, Alfred boards the returning transport truck heading back toward camp through dark roads lined with pines bending softly beneath the rain. The convoy moves slowly through the coastal darkness while headlights reflect against wet pavement and standing water gathered in the ditches beside the road. Camp Lejeune glows faintly beyond the forests as they pass. Barracks, depots, training grounds. The enormous machinery of the Marine Corps stretching outward beneath wartime skies. And somewhere inside that machinery now, woven through its routines too deeply to fully remove cleanly anymore, Black Marines have become part of the institution's lived reality. Not fully accepted. Not equal. But undeniable. And perhaps institutions fear undeniability more than protest, because protest can be resisted openly. Reality, once repeated long enough, becomes harder to exile back into silence. The return of memory. Years later, the roads around Montford Point look smaller than the men remember them. The war has ended by then. Ships no longer depart continuously from the coastal ports carrying Marines toward distant islands and shattered shorelines across the Pacific. The freight yards quiet gradually. Barracks empty in uneven waves as demobilization spreads through the military like a long exhausted exhale after years spent holding tension too tightly inside the body of the nation. Yet certain places refuse to disappear completely once enough memory settles into them. You stand beside the old camp roads beneath a pale winter sky while wind moves softly through the Carolina pines. Some of the original buildings remain. Others have vanished beneath newer construction or simply collapsed under weather and neglect after the urgency of war faded away. Mud still gathers in the lower stretches of road after rainstorms. Salt air still drifts inland from the coast, carrying the faint smell of marsh water and distant ocean. But the atmosphere has changed. The silence now feels historical rather than temporary. Alfred walks slowly along the edge of what had once been the parade ground. Time has altered the place unevenly. Certain details return immediately: the angle of the floodlights, the shape of the drainage ditches, the way coastal wind crosses the open ground before dawn. Other memories arrive more slowly, buried beneath years spent building ordinary civilian life after military service ended. That is the strange thing about institutions. They often continue living inside people long after the official relationship ends. Nearby, several younger Marines move between newer buildings carrying equipment toward transport vehicles parked near the modernized sections of the base. Some glance briefly toward Alfred without recognition before continuing on. To them, the camp belongs to history already. A place mentioned occasionally in training materials or official commemorations. Something settled safely into the past. But memory rarely feels safe to the people who carried it firsthand. You watch Alfred stop near the remains of one older barracks foundation where only sections of weathered support beams still rise above the ground. Grass pushes through cracks in the concrete now. Pine needles gather where rows of bunks once stood beneath low ceilings filled with the smell of damp wool, shoe polish, and radiator heat struggling against winter cold. The younger Marines nearby cannot fully see those older rooms anymore. But Alfred can. The long nights listening to generators hum beyond the walls. The early formation whistles before sunrise. The pressure of observation settling invisibly over every routine until it became difficult to remember movement without it. And yet memory softens certain edges over time too. Not the separation. Not the exhaustion. But the uncertainty. Because history eventually answered questions the men at Montford Point had once been forced to carry without certainty. The Corps had changed. Slowly. Unevenly, imperfectly, but permanently enough that the silence surrounding Black Marines could never fully restore itself afterward to its original form. A museum guide passes nearby leading a small group through the preserved sections of camp. Their voices drift faintly through the winter air. First Black Marines of the modern Corps. Wartime necessity and social pressure. Segregated training facilities. The language sounds careful now. Official. Historical. Institutions prefer polished memory once enough time passes to make honesty safer. Alfred listens quietly without interrupting. Because the lived reality had never felt as clean as museum language eventually makes it sound. It had smelled of wet lumber and diesel smoke. It had sounded like boots moving through mud before dawn and typewriters striking paper in administrative offices, unsure how to process the future arriving through their own doors. And perhaps that is what history struggles hardest to preserve. Not the milestones. The atmosphere. The feeling of existing inside change before anyone knew whether the institutions surrounding it would truly hold. A young Marine separated briefly from the tour group notices Alfred standing near the old foundation. "You serve here?" the man asks politely. Alfred nods once. The younger Marine studies the ground for a moment. What was it like? The question hangs softly in the cold air between them. Beyond the trees, the modern Corps continues moving through ordinary routine, engines starting, radios crackling, transport trucks crossing roads widened long ago after the war. The institution survived, expanded, adapted. Yet traces of the older silence still linger faintly beneath the surface of memory like foundations buried beneath newer construction. Alfred looks across the old parade ground before answering. "It was separate," he says calmly. "But it was still the Corps." The younger Marine nods slowly as though trying to understand something larger hidden inside the sentence. Then the guide calls the group forward again, and the moment passes quietly back into the wind moving through the pines. The afternoon light fades early across the old camp. Winter clouds drift inland from the coast in long grey layers that flatten the sky above Montford Point until shadows dissolve almost completely into the pale cold air. The tour groups thin gradually as the day moves toward evening. Museum staff close doors. Vehicles depart along roads that once carried convoys loaded with recruits, supplies, uncertainty. Silence returns differently now. Not the tense silence of waiting. A reflective one. You walk with Alfred along the outer edge of the preserved grounds where the pine forest begins reclaiming sections of land once stripped bare for wartime construction. Needles cover old pathways. Grass rises through broken concrete. Time continues its quiet work against everything institutions once believed permanent. Yet traces remain. A rusted drainage pipe half buried beneath earth. Faded support posts near the remains of a barracks foundation. The outline of parade grounds still visible if you know how to look across the land carefully enough. Memory survives this way sometimes, not as complete preservation, but as shape. A coastal wind moves through the trees carrying the distant sound of modern traffic from roads expanded decades after the war. The newer Marine Corps exists all around the old camp now, larger and more technologically complex than the institution Alfred first entered through hesitant recruiting offices and unfinished camp roads. Different uniforms, different barracks, different assumptions held by younger generations who inherited changes they never personally fought to force into existence. And perhaps that is how history often works. The people who endure transformation rarely experience it as clarity. Only the generations afterward inherit the cleaner narrative. Alfred pauses near the shoreline path where marsh grass bends beneath the winter wind beyond the old camp perimeter. The Atlantic lies somewhere beyond the low dunes hidden beneath fog and fading light. During the war, transport craft trained near these waters constantly. Engines roaring before dawn. Marines wading through cold surf carrying rifles overhead. The coast had felt temporary then, merely another stage in preparation for larger violence waiting overseas. Now the shoreline feels quieter than memory allows. A historian working with the preservation staff approaches slowly along the path carrying folders beneath one arm. "Mr. Masters." Alfred turns slightly. The historian smiles politely against the cold wind. "We've been trying to verify some records from the early intake rosters. Your name appears on several of the first transport assignments." Alfred nods once. The historian removes several photographs carefully from the folder. Old black and white images softened at the edges with age. Barracks under construction. Formation lines across muddy parade grounds. Young Marines standing beside transport trucks beneath floodlights and unfinished roads. You remember any of these? For a moment Alfred studies the photographs without answering. The younger faces inside the images look impossibly distant now. Yet the atmosphere returns immediately. The smell of wet lumber. Generator noise after dark. Boots drying beside overheated radiators. The exhausting awareness of being observed constantly while simply trying to survive military routine with dignity intact. Finally he points quietly toward one blurred photograph of the early camp roads. "That was after rain," he says softly. "Roads stayed like rivers for days sometimes." The historian smiles faintly while making notes. Most official history searches for milestones, dates, policies, firsts. But the lived memory returns through smaller details instead. Mud, noise, waiting rooms, the shape of floodlights through coastal fog before dawn. You watch the historian carefully place the photographs back into the folder while evening settles fully across the old camp. "We're trying to preserve as much as possible," the man says. Alfred looks once more toward the fading parade grounds beyond the trees. "Preserve the feeling too if you can," he answers quietly. "Not just the facts." The historian pauses at that. Then nods slowly. Because facts alone cannot fully explain what Montford Point had truly been. Not merely segregation. Not merely reopening. But the emotional experience of existing inside an institution slowly confronting the return of people it had trained itself for generations not to imagine within its own identity. As darkness gathers over the Carolina coast, lights begin appearing across the modern base beyond the forest. Vehicles move through widened roads. Radios crackle faintly through the cold air. Young Marines continue crossing grounds where earlier generations once stood beneath entirely different assumptions about who belonged inside the uniform. The Corps survived the change, even if it never fully understood the moment while living through it. And perhaps that is the final truth settling quietly across places like Montford Point after enough years pass. History rarely arrives through dramatic revelation. More often, it enters slowly through ordinary routine until one day institutions wake to discover the impossible has already become memory. After the door opened. Long after the war ends, the Marine Corps continues carrying traces of the old silence inside itself. Not openly. Institutions rarely display their older contradictions plainly once history has judged them uncomfortable. Instead, the traces survive indirectly, through archives, through photographs, through buildings preserved more carefully than the emotions once contained inside them. Younger Marines inherit the finished structure without always seeing the pressure required to reshape it in the first place. But pressure leaves marks even after the surface appears settled. You stand beside the old roads of Montford Point beneath early evening light fading softly across the Carolina coast. Wind moves through the pines with the same low sound it carried during the war years, though now the camp feels smaller against the vastness of the modern core surrounding it. New highways cross land once occupied by muddy transport tracks. Permanent buildings stand where temporary barracks once leaned beneath floodlights and rain. Yet memory continues pulling certain places backward through time. Alfred walks slowly near the preserved entrance road while shadows lengthen across the ground. The museum staff have already closed most of the buildings for the evening. Only a few distant lights remain visible near the visitor center where displays and photographs attempt to organize history into something neat enough for future generations to understand comfortably. But lived experience had never felt neat. It had felt unfinished while it was happening. That distinction matters. A cold breeze carries salt air inland from the Atlantic while Alfred pauses near one of the preserved signposts marking the old boundaries of camp. During the war, boundaries had existed everywhere here, some physical, some emotional, many left deliberately unspoken because institutions often prefer silence to clarity when confronting contradictions within themselves. Now tourists walk these same grounds reading historical plaques. The transformation feels strange even decades later. Because once, the Marine Corps had treated Black Marines as administrative uncertainty. Now the institution preserves Montford Point as heritage. You notice the emotional weight of that contradiction settling quietly across the landscape itself. Nearby, a young family crosses the grounds slowly while a father points toward one of the preserved barracks buildings. A small boy wearing a modern Marine sweatshirt asks questions too quietly to fully hear from where Alfred stands. The father kneels briefly beside him explaining something while gesturing toward the old parade grounds stretching beyond the museum buildings into fading light. Then they continue walking. Ordinary. Unremarkable. And perhaps that is the most profound change of all. The existence of Black Marines no longer feels institutionally strange to the child crossing the grounds. History has already shifted too deeply for the older silence to fully reconstruct itself inside younger generations the way it once had. Alfred watches the family disappear gradually into the evening. During the war years, many men at Montford Point had not known whether the Corps would truly change once the emergency passed. Some believed the institution would simply close the door again afterward. Others hoped service itself might force permanent transformation through sheer undeniability. The truth became more complicated than either certainty. Progress arrived unevenly. Resistance survived longer than many expected. Yet the reopening could never fully reverse itself afterward because too many men had already crossed through it carrying uniforms, memories, military records, friendships, grief. Reality had accumulated. And institutions struggle to erase accumulated reality once enough people remember it together. The coastal sky darkens gradually toward deep blue beyond the trees while floodlights begin appearing across the modern base farther inland. Trucks move along distant roads carrying Marines who know Montford Point as history rather than present reality. Radios crackle faintly somewhere beyond the museum grounds. The core continues forward. Larger now. Different. Still imperfect. But permanently altered by the generations it once tried not to imagine inside itself at all. Alfred stands quietly beside the old road for a long time without moving. The wind shifts again through the pines. Somewhere far away, a train horn echoes faintly through the Carolina evening before fading back into distance. The same sound that once carried recruits south toward unfinished barracks, muddy roads, floodlights, uncertainty. Toward a door reopening slowly enough that almost no one inside the institution fully understood the future entering with them at the time. Night settles slowly across the Carolina coast. The museum grounds empty completely now except for a few maintenance lights glowing near the preserved barracks and visitor center windows reflecting darkness back against themselves. Beyond the trees, the modern Marine Corps continues moving through ordinary evening routine. Trucks crossing widened roads, radios murmuring through guard stations, young Marines laughing somewhere outside barracks built long after the war that first forced the institution to change. The sound reaches the old camp faintly, distant enough to feel almost like memory itself. You walk beside Alfred through the quiet remains of Montford Point where cold wind brushes softly across the open parade grounds. Pine needles gather along the edges of old pathways once worn flat beneath thousands of marching boots. Time has softened the outlines of the camp, but not erased them. Certain places resist disappearing completely once enough lives have passed through them carrying pressure, exhaustion, and history together. That may be the final lesson of Montford Point. Not victory. Presence. The Marine Corps had spent generations treating black Marines as absence within its own identity. Then the war forced the institution into negotiation with reality it could no longer comfortably avoid. At first the reopening arrived through hesitation, separate roads, separate barracks, careful administrative distance designed to contain change while still extracting service from the men crossing the threshold. But institutions underestimate routine at their own risk. Because once people work beside one another long enough, once names appear repeatedly on rosters, once uniforms become ordinary sights instead of symbolic disruptions, memory itself begins reorganizing around the new reality. And memory, unlike policy, cannot be fully ordered backward once enough people share it. Alfred stops near the edge of the old parade ground where the wind moves freely across the open space beneath a sky filled with slow winter clouds drifting inland from the sea. During the war, floodlights once burned here before dawn while young Marines stood at attention carrying the invisible weight of representation on top of ordinary military exhaustion. Every inspection had seemed larger than itself. Every mistake potentially symbolic. Every success measured carefully by institutions uncertain what conclusions they wished to draw from it. Now the ground lies quiet beneath moonlight. Grass bends softly in the wind where formation lines once stretched through mud and frost and rain. You realize how strange history becomes after enough time passes. What once felt emotionally unbearable to live through eventually settles into museum displays, educational tours, preserved foundations marked by plaques explaining events in calm, polished language. Future generations inherit conclusions without always inheriting the atmosphere that produced them. But the atmosphere mattered. The waiting rooms. The unfinished roads. The silence after certain names was spoken aloud inside recruiting offices. The long ordinary routines through which the impossible slowly became operational fact. That was the real transformation. Not speeches. Not headlines. Repetition. Across the modern base beyond the forest, headlights move steadily along distant roads while aircraft pass faintly overhead toward larger installations farther inland. The Corps continues adapting to new eras, new wars, new political realities. Institutions survive by changing gradually enough that they can later pretend the transformation had always been inevitable. Yet Montford Point remains here quietly contradicting that illusion. A reminder that certain doors were not opened willingly. They were opened because reality pressed against them long enough that keeping them closed became harder than allowing history to enter. Alfred looks once more across the old camp before turning slowly toward the road leading back toward the visitor center lights. Behind him, the parade grounds remain still beneath the Carolina night. Ahead, the modern core moves forward carrying traces of the old silence and the people who interrupted it permanently. And somewhere between those two worlds, between exclusion and memory, between hesitation and ordinary presence, the story of Alfred Masters settles into its final shape. Not as the story of one man conquering an institution, but as the story of an institution slowly discovering it could no longer honestly imagine itself without the people it once refused to see within it at all. The wind moves again through the pines. Then even that sound fades softly into the dark. Years after the war, the photographs remain quieter than the reality had been. Black and white images preserved inside archives show Marines standing beside barracks, transport trucks, parade grounds darkened by rain or dust depending on the season. Uniforms appear sharp. Formation lines orderly. Faces often unreadable beneath the limits of wartime cameras and official documentation. Future generations study these images searching for historical significance inside still frames frozen long after the movement itself ended. But the movement had never felt still while it was happening. It had sounded like boots crossing muddy roads before sunrise. Like typewriters striking paper in offices uncertain how to process the future entering through their own doors. Like engines idling beside unfinished barracks while young Marines learned how to exist inside an institution struggling to redefine itself without openly admitting it was changing at all. You stand once more beside the old roads of Montford Point beneath the last quiet stretch of Carolina night before dawn. The modern base beyond the trees hums faintly with distant generators and passing vehicles, but here the older silence lingers differently now. Not oppressive. Historical. The kind of silence places carry after enough memory settles into the ground beneath them. Pine wind moves softly through the darkness. Somewhere far beyond the coast, waves continue breaking against shorelines that once trained Marines for wars now folded carefully into textbooks and museum displays. Generations have passed through the Corps since Alfred Masters first stepped into recruiting offices where clerks hesitated over paperwork because history itself had arrived before the institution fully understood how to receive it. And yet the traces remain. Not only in archives or preserved buildings. In normalization. In ordinary presence. In younger Marines inheriting a Corps already altered by changes earlier generations once considered impossible. That may be the quietest truth carried forward from Montford Point. The men who entered through those separate gates did not merely endure exclusion. They interrupted permanence. Slowly enough that the institution often failed to recognize the transformation while living through it, yet deeply enough that the older silence could never fully reconstruct itself afterward in its original form. No single speech accomplished that. No singular moment. Only repetition. Routine. Thousands of ordinary days through which reality accumulated until denial itself became harder to sustain honestly. The sky begins lightening faintly above the pines now. Not sunrise yet. Only the first soft change in darkness before morning fully arrives. You imagine the old camp waking again as it once did, whistles before dawn, boots against wet floorboards, floodlights glowing through coastal fog while young Marines crossed muddy roads carrying exhaustion and uncertainty together into another day beneath observation. Most of them could not know what history would eventually call them. Most were too occupied simply surviving the present tense of military life to imagine how future generations might reinterpret the weight they carried through ordinary routine. But history remembers more than institutions intend sometimes. And places like Montford Point remain because the ground itself refuses complete forgetting. The wind moves once more through the trees. Then gradually the first light reaches the old parade ground where generations earlier Black Marines stood waiting inside a course, slowly learning that once a door has opened long enough for reality to pass through it, silence can never fully close around the absence again. You've been part of echoes of war, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.